Hi, friends. This is Dee Dee, and she's giving away this awesome custom PC. Ironside Computers is sponsoring this video to share their awesome new Legend of Etru giveaway. Ironside Computers is a company ran by four siblings who have been building quality PCs for over 15 years. And right now they're running an immersive giveaway of their absolutely beautiful handcrafted custom PC sculpted and painted in-house by Dee Dee that features a spectacular bioluminescent jungle themed mixed with some Eldritch vibes. I'd personally want this just to stick some Catachan and nids all over the case for like a overgrown manufactorum look or something. I think that would just be really incredible on my work desk. And the giveaway goes beyond typical raffles with cool weekly challenges that increase entries, as well as having unique lore. Which I know all of us 40k fans just love lore, silly little games, and quality computers, so it's a win win win. Oh, and for a fourth and perhaps best win, it's all free to enter and has worldwide shipping. So, if you want to enter for a chance to win this unique PC, be sure to enter at my link below and sign up. And beyond that, you should also totally check out the Ironside store page. They have some really incredible looking pre-builts and components. Plus, their PCs feature a 3-year hardware warranty, 5-year labor warranty, and a lifetime of in-house tech support. My personal favorite of their PCs is their cute and silly Juicebox PC, especially the Honeydew one since I'm a sucker for green and melons. But honestly, all their PCs look really great, so it'd be worth checking out. So go visit their store page on my other link below. Hi, friends. Taxes! Did I startle you? Good. If you were surprised by that, you'll be doubly surprised when the IRS raids your house. Yep, everyone hates taxes, but do you hate taxes enough to wage a decade-long war against the very imperium you dearly love and swore to protect? That's right. Today we're going to cover one of the most iconic, if not the most iconic battle of all of 40k, the Badab War. The Badab War is notable since it began as basically a silly little legal battle that escalated into a multi-chapter Space Marine Civil War with iconic dudes like the Salamanders, the Lamenters, and the Space Sharks. Woo! And before we get into all that, I just want to say this is going to be a super abridged version, so if this video leaves you thirsting for more, there's plenty of hour-long, in-depth videos out there to watch, or even better, read the actual Imperial Armor books for the fullest experience. If you can find them, that is. But let's just get right into it. This tale of brotherly bickering begins with the big blue boys of Badab, namely the chapter master Luft Huron, otherwise known as the Tyrant of Badab. With a name like that, I bet these guys won't cause any problems in the future. Huron came to power after he quelled a coup and took his chapter, the Astral Claws, recruiting world of Badab, under his rule to ensure that it would never be threatened again. Figuring that he was just such a great ruler and knowing that another notable blue chapter got to own their own sector, Huron said, "Well, I can do that," and proclaimed himself the ruler of the entire Badab sector so that he could, quote unquote, better protect the worlds and the glory of the Emperor. Hey, you can't just declare yourself the ruler of Badab. Why not? It's against the rules. Well, I'm the ruler and I make the rules. You got me there. And Badab was known for being in a little spot known as the Maelstrom Zone. This zone was a group of sectors that were near the second largest warp storm in the galaxy. So, to ward the Maelstrom and keep it manageable, the High Lords created a group of Marines creatively named the Maelstrom Warders, notably including the Lamenters, Mantis Warriors, and Astral Claws. Oh, and would you look at that? We're back at Huron's boys. Luft Huron and his Astral Claws led the Maelstrom Warders, and they were actually extremely good at their job. So good, in fact, that when he requested more resources and manpower to quell the Maelstrom once and for all, the Administratum ignored him since he seemed to be doing fine without. If you won't pay for my crusade, then I'll do it myself. And I'm also not paying taxes. So he paused Badab's ties, closed trade routes, and slowed his gene seed payments to Terra in order to bolster his forces and begin his liberation campaign. And this gene seed hoarding will be especially significant later, so keep it in mind. And the Greater Imperium didn't really take any major action against Huron for his withdrawal ties, and the brunt of his actions were mostly felt by the Carthagin trade lords, who were responsible for processing Badab's resource tithes. The trade lords got pissed off at Huron since they were running short on their payments due to Huron's actions, and they tried to take action against the tyrant. However, it was a tricky legal issue since both parties were technically right to an extent. On one hand, imperial tithes are required by the administratum, and usually, if a world fails to pay these tithes, they get a visit from the IRS, the Inquisitorial Revenue Service, that is, which is somehow even less fun than getting a visit from the real life IRS. But on the other hand, Space Marines technically do have the ancient rights to, do whatever the hell they want. I am paraphrasing a bit, but Marines actually do have the general right to do whatever is necessary to defend the Imperium. So, considering that the Maelstrom is such a tempestuous zone, weather joke, there could be an argument made that Huron's actions were justified. But, anyways, Huron used his stolen resources to gather a large force. The Astral Claws, their successors, the Tiger Claws, and the rest of the warriors began a huge liberation campaign and were joined by the Black Templars, who are always down a clown. If by clown, you mean brutally curb stomping some heretics, of course. These fellas broke further into the maelstrom than ever before. But unfortunately, this success was short lived, and Huron was cucked again as the Black Templars were summoned to the Ultramar sector, and the warders had to halt their crusade. And to make things even worse for good old Ronnie, his legal troubles were catching up to him as it seemed the Imperium would likely side with the Carthagins. Emboldened by this, the Carthagins sent some ships to tell Ronald that Mommy said it's time to give them back their toys or else the claws are in big trouble. And by toys, I of course mean important resources, ships, guns, etc. Huron lets them know that Badab is a DE sector so they can F off, and then the Carthagin fleet hits them with the no. So then Huron hits them with a bunch of shells from the Badab defense cannons. And the Carthagins were, of course, pissed off yet again and sent some more ships that mysteriously vanished. Just like how my delectable lunches mysteriously vanish from the office fridge. I'm just kidding. I'm a YouTuber and I don't have a real job, and the only thing that mysteriously vanishes for me is all of my time and self respect. Oh. But that aside, the Carthagins realize that they're not cavemen, and in the modern age, if you can't beat someone, well, you just gotta spread hateful rumors about them. So they send propaganda that Huron and his chapter are heretics, and also they probably have little tiny wieners as well. Huron responds to these crazy rumors that he betrayed the Imperium by creating his articles of just succession, in which he proves how loyal and dedicated to the Imperium he truly is by declaring himself exempt from stupid taxes and leaving the Imperium. Also, he and his Marines, they have very large wieners. Although he and the warriors wanted to succeed from the Imperium, they were legitimately still loyal. Huron just thought that his mission of protecting and quelling the Maelstrom was above stupid things like taxes and pestering trade lords. And the other warder chapters joined because they believed it was their duty to protect the Maelstrom and stand by their brothers. So, the Carthagins furthered their efforts and sought allies, but they were largely ignored, perhaps due to their supposed not so large wieners. In their desperation, they began to directly call some Space Marine chapters, and finally someone answered. The Firehawks heed the call, and they send some investigation ships. These ships are then attacked by the Mantis Warriors. Despite their 4 times type advantage, the Firehawk ships are disabled by the Mantis fleet and they're taken prisoner. Even though the Mantis Warriors acted relatively civil and gave back the prisoners, the Mantis Warriors' actions really bugged the Firehawks and they sent their entire fleet into the Maelstrom Zone to get revenge. While the Firehawks fought the Mantis Warriors, the Astral Claws and Lamenters captured some more loyalist worlds in the sector in order to secure even more resources. The Firehawk forces were whittling down, but received reinforcements from the Marines Errant chapter. However, the Marines Errant did not directly attack, and they only helped secure trade routes for the Loyalists since they were kind of besties with the Lamenters. These two chapters kind of pulled a Hawkeye and Black Widow for their civil war and didn't really fight each other. Moreover, the Executioners also joined the Astral Claws due to an ancient blood debt, and the secessionists pretty much destroy the Carthagin forces when the Carthagins try to capture Depot World for much needed supplies. This was done because the warriors knew that people wanted to read about Space Marines, not trade lords. Sorry, Carthagins, people simply don't care about trade disputes. For a while, the secessionists were smacking the loyalists since they significantly outnumbered them, which, throughout this video, keep in mind the secessionists are working with their entire chapter, and the Astral Claws have been hoarding Gene Seed and merged with the Tiger Claws, so they're basically a mega chapter at this point. But this is also when the Greater Imperium finally decides to give a damn. Since so many chapters are fighting each other, the High Lord sent Inquisitors to investigate the Bad Ebb sector and see what all the hullabaloo is about. Due to the missing ties and gene seed payments, the Inquisitors deemed the Astral Claws to be the more guilty party, and they ordered them to lower their defenses and stop this tomfoolery. However, Mr. Luft, I always know best, Huron said, nah, I know best, and if I followed your silly ass request, then the Maelstrom Zone would be in danger. This proved to be something I like to call a big fat mistake, and the Inquisition assembled a marine force composing of the Salamanders, Raptors, Fire Angels, and Red Scorpions. The Marines Aaron and Firehawks were subbed out to regroup their forces, but before leaving, the Hawks left a cute little parting gift called a million firebombs that decimated a Mantis warrior planet in revenge for their past transgressions. After some more fighting, a phrase I will no doubt use like 100 more times in this video, Left Nut Huron called for a parlay at an asteroid base called Grief. Oh, I can't see anything going wrong in a place such as this. So Huron, Chapter Master Sartak of the Mantis Warriors, and Lord Commander Otis of the Red Scorpions met to discuss their war. But just like playing a game of Among Us, it quickly devolved into rampant accusations and finger pointing. You know what would make negotiations go more smoothly? Getting shot at. Oh, did I say smooth? I meant bad. So, amidst the finger pointing, the base was suddenly attacked by three unidentified ships, and the barrage killed both Sartak and Ortis. The attacker was never officially identified, but the Loyalists blamed Huron for the betrayal at Grief, Huron blamed inquisitorial conspirators, and others suspect chaos saboteurs. But whoever it was, just like how you ruined your parents' marriage, they ruined any chance of the secessionists and loyalists cooperating and gave us access to more epic battles. Woo! And so soon after, more chapters joined the Loyalists, including the Sons of Medusa, Howling Griffins, Nova Marines, and some Vanguard Minotaur forces, while the Marines Aaron withdraw entirely. The Raptors, Salamanders, and Fire Angels fight some Astral Claws and Mantis Warriors in the jungles, take some more territory, fight, you know how it goes. And amidst some more fighting, some of the secessionist worlds are threatened by Chaos Corsair fleets and some Orc clans. And this is a reminder that the secessionists are still technically loyal to the Imperium and believe themselves to be doing the Emperor's will. These attacks force the secessionists to fall back and defend against the forces of the Maelstrom. So then, more fighting occurs, the Minotaurs fully arrive and launch a full-scale assault on Cairo, slaughtering Huron's Tyrant Legion PDF force, and then goes on to take nearly a whole sector by themselves. Meanwhile, the Salamanders and Fire Angels steam some hams in Galen, and the Red Scorpions help the Minotaurs completely destroy the PDF at Varian. In hopes of turning the tide of the battle, the Astral Claws attempt to recover ancient buried weapons on planet Synax. In response, the Loyalists prepared for the largest push of the war and gathered all their chapters along with the newly arrived Exorcists for the Sagan offensive, named so because the Astral Claws were about to sug on some nuts. The Astral Claws doggedly defended their planet, but unfortunately, they didn't have that dog in them, and they were in fact just big pussies. Eventually, in their desperation, they resorted to some dishonorable tactics like suicide runs and the use of virus bombs. But after some more fighting, the world was finally taken by Loyalist forces and made it their central fortress for the rest of the war. And this was a huge strategic win for the Loyalists, as it almost completely severed the Mantis Warriors from the rest of the Secessionists, meaning that the Mantis Warriors had to defend their home sector of the Endymion Cluster by themselves. After this battle, due to the war nearing completion, the Raptors, Nova Marines, and Howling Griffins were sent to the Ultima sector to fight some orcs. However, it is said that the Inquisition sent them away since these three chapters were not, quote-unquote, hard enough to be trusted to brutally murder the rest of their brothers in the final stages of the war. Oh, does somebody not want to eradicate their brothers? Oh, boo-hoo! Minotaurs! Come here and murder some yellow crybabies for me! The Inquisition also wanted to boot the Salamanders since they were also deemed too nice, but the Salamanders basically said that they're an OG chapter so they do what they want. But back to the aforementioned yellow crybabies. The Minotaurs captured some of the Lamentor's gene seed and used it to spring a trap. In the ambush, the Minotaurs boarded the Lamentor ship and brutally slaughtered them in a frantic melee. Only 311 Lamentors survived, and they were taken prisoner for the rest of the war. Elsewhere, the Red Scorpions and Salamanders continued to do work and destroyed a supply transfer to the Astral Claws from the neutral Forge world of Ingstrom. This goaded the Mechanicus forces into attacking both Loyalist and Successionist worlds since the stupid Marine fighting spilled into their world. After some more fighting, the Mantis Warriors proved to be a troubling force. Although outnumbered, they leveraged their home field advantage with hit and run tactics. Luckily for the Loyalists, and unluckily for anyone repping the Koopa Troopa colors, the Carcharodons arrived and began a massive terror campaign on the ironically named Tranquility System. There, the Carcharodons launched a planet-wide assault led by Tiberos the Red Wake. Woo! On Endymion Prime, the space sharks shot drop pods all over the place and decimated the Mantis Warriors. Also, Tibers was one hardcore scary dude. He's like a head taller than the average Terminator. He wears double power fists that are strapped with lightning claws, just in case a power fist didn't kill something hard enough. And then, if those double power fist lightning claws still don't kill something hard enough, they also have double chainswords under them. That's a total of 13 weapons, 10 blades, 2 fists, 1 scary motherfucker. After all was said and done, the Space Sharks killed the Mantis Warriors so brutally that the Fire Angels were disgusted and they withdrew from the Badab War. But after some more fighting, the Minotaurs, Sons of Medusa, and some penal legions attacked the south side of the Badab sector. Then, some of the Minotaurs were also sent to destroy an Astral Claw training world with the Salamanders. It was here where the Salamanders discovered that Astral Claw corpse takers have been stealing gene seed throughout the war to strengthen the Astral Claw forces. After some more fighting, the Salamanders recovered the seed, and on their return to the Loyalist base, they were ambushed by the Astral Claws and Executioner chapters. Outgunned and outnumbered, the Salamanders are forced to surrender, and as they're officiating the surrender, the Astral Claws attacked the Salamander ship, stole the gene seed, and slaughtered prisoners. Ironically, the Executioners had a bit of a problem with the Claws executing the surrendered Salamanders, and they turned on their former allies. The enraged Executioners killed the Astral Claws president and left the war to attack other Astral Claw holdouts. This left the Astral Claws as the only Successionist chapter. Even though the chapter is illegally large, things were looking bad for Team Tyrant. Huron began to go a bit kooky, and he officially renounced the Imperium and prepared his final defenses. The Loyalists pushed the Astral Claws all the way back to the planet of Badab Primus and began a three-pronged attack to overwhelm the Badab defenses. The Sons of Medusa, Firehawks, and Star Phantoms attacked the Orbital Fortress Monastery, Carcharodons assaulted the Hives, sowing terror per usual, and the Star Phantoms, Titan Legions, and Inquisitorial Stormtroopers stormed Huron's final fortress, the Palace of Thorns. After days of brutal fighting, the Space Sharks overloaded the Hive's power grids, disabling the defenses and allowing the Star Phantoms to finally siege the palace. Huron and some of the Astral Claws escaped, but the Badab War was finally won. Afterwards, the Mantis Warriors, Lamentors, and Executioners were deemed guilty but not traitors and given the mercy of a century-long penitent crusade where they would be thrown into the toughest battles to prove their faith. These crusades were especially brutal since the chapters were decimated during the war. Notably, however, the Executioners' punishment was a bit lighter since they were said to have fought honorably during the war and they defended the Salamanders towards the end of the war. As for Huron and the boys, the Astral Claws became the Red Corsairs, and Huron became Huron Blackheart, eventually aligning with Chaos. His Red Corsairs terrorized the Maelstrom zone that they once sought to protect. As for the Maelstrom itself, it eventually became part of the Great Rift after the fall of Cadia. And finally, there's the Lamentors, who continue to get their faces kicked in at every turn. So yeah, that's the Badab War. Very cool stuff. And again, this is a very abridged version of the story, but I think I covered all the main points and hopefully properly demonstrated how crazily things spiral from a pretty minor bureaucratic issue. I also love all these old color schemes, like, you can't beat green, but these salamanders, they certainly come close, and the Tiger Claws, they really dedicated themselves to their shtick. Hi friends, today we're going to talk about a pretty iconic battle that I think is a bit underrated. It's not the biggest battle in the setting, it doesn't feature any founding chapters, and on a galactic scale, it hardly mattered. However, it has a ton of memorable moments, iconic imagery, and features my favorite Imperial Fist chapter successor. Yeah, Templars are super cool, but to me, the Crimson Fist are the best fisters around. Wait, not like that. Plus, they're the OG poster boys. But anyways, if you want epic orc killing action, iconic last stands, and surprisingly wholesome moments, then this is the battle for you. Let's get into it. The seeds of this battle were sown when the dreaded orcs invaded the world of Bad Landing, which was a neighboring world to Rin's world. Here, the Greenskins quickly defeated the planet's PDF along with the Mordian 18th. So, the Crimson Fist's third company, led by Captain Draken, was mobilized to cleanse the planet of the orcs. The Fist anticipated an easy victory, but were surprised by the immense number of the gargantuan war boss Snagrod's warband. And Arch-Arsonist Snagrod is a total beast. He's said to have been as broad as a dreadnought, he wears no armor at all, and he's surprisingly tactical for an orc. So, under Snagrod's leadership, eventually the Fists were bested on Bad Landing, with a big factor in their loss being the death of Captain Draken thanks to a vainglorious scout. A scout named Ken caught sight of the war boss and had a shot lined up, but was told to hold fire since it would ruin Draken's plans. However, he disobeyed orders, trying to claim the glory of felling a humongo war boss and turning the tide of battle. And, he turned the tide of the battle all right. Although his shots were masterfully placed, Snagrod had a force field and was alerted to the Marines' presence. Subsequently, Draken was killed and the Marines' rescue efforts fell apart. Of the 84 Marines present, only 28 survived. After their loss, Kennen was largely blamed and his fellow Fists declared, "He's a good shot, but smart fella, he is not." And they turned him into a gun servitor to utilize his good ballistic skill stat while also lobotomizing his dum-dum brain. But anyways, after their bad landing on Bad Landing, the Fists realized the gravity of the situation and summoned all Crimson Fist companies to their home world of Rin's world to defend against an orc retaliation. Many of the governors of the world underestimated the orc threat, just like the Fist had on Bad Landing. This would prove to be what I call a moron move. Well, technically it wasn't that stupid, as they assumed the orcs wouldn't have a chance against the Space Marine homeworld, which is usually true, but more on that soon. Anyways, Super Chad Lord Hellblade Pedro Cantor was preparing a huge defense at the Arx Tyrannus that would serve as the main bastion against the Green Tide, with auxiliary defenses in other cities while they waited for reinforcements. A few hundred Marines, led by 2nd Company Captain Drago Alves, were sent to the capital city of New Rin City and other cities on the planet while Cantor prepared the Fist Fortress Monastery of Arx Tyrannus for the incoming Wah! Also, their fortress monastery is made from their old capital ship in the Hellblade Mountains of Rin's world, which is pretty cool. Anyways, the orcs led a huge blitzkrieg attack and crushed the Imperial orbital defenses and made planetfall. During the landing, the Crimson Fist Fortress Monastery, the Arx Tyrannus, pulled one of the worst, if not the worst, blunders in the entire setting. Somehow, with in-canon trillion-to-1 odds, the orbital defense system shot a missile who really took the miss part of its name to heart when it not only missed the orc ships that it was shot at, but did a full 180 and fucking blasted the fortress it was shot from. Actually insane. This was catastrophically unlucky, as it not only destroyed the Fist arsenal and gene stock, but also killed hundreds of Marines. Imagine being a veteran of centuries of war, crafted to be the ultimate soldier, surviving all of the galaxy's biggest threats. Your mere presence means total annihilation, and then you get killed by your house's own missile. And I thought that the Lamenters were unlucky. Wait, also, what the hell, orcs? I thought that blue was the lucky color. Or, I guess that the Crimson Fist blue made the orcs so lucky that this little mishap was able to happen. But also, all the able-bodied enemy combatants blowing themselves up before the real scrap can even begin sounds pretty damn unlucky for the battle-loving orcs, so yeah, I guess nothing makes sense in this damn crazy world. But anyways, nearly all hope for the world was lost along with the majority of the chapter. The only Marines to survive were those patrolling the outer defenses with Pedro Cantor, and the few hundred Marines who were preparing a city defense at the planet's capital, New Rin City. Pedro Cantor, and the other 15 survivors of the monastery incident, including Captain Alessio Cortez, the Immortal, who were said to be unkillable and is kind of besties with Pedro Cantor, plan to rendezvous with their battle brothers in the capital. Due to their crippled ranks, the majority of the Fist focused on defending New Rin City, and all the other cities of Rin's world quickly fell to the Green Tide. In the city, as the orcs massed up, Captain Alves debated with his sergeant, Huron Grimm, about instating the Xeris Protocol. This was an ancient edict that stated that Marines were only to die if they were saving a fellow Marine. So basically, they'd forget about defending Imperial citizens in order to keep the chapter alive. While callous, this did make sense as the chapter suffered heavy casualties and the Imperial citizens wouldn't last very long if the fists were to fall anyways. Meanwhile, as the chapter fortified the city, Cantor and crew fought their way towards the capital to join the final stand. On his journey, Pedro Cantor showed why he was the best. Kinda similar to Grimaldus, Cantor struggled with balancing his chapter survival with protecting Imperial citizens. On one hand, he had a strong sense of morality and instinctually wanted to help all he came across. But on the other, he also knows that sacrifice must be made, especially when things were so dire for his chapter and planet. In his training, Cantor was even told that his high moral standards would become a big weakness for him and that sometimes honorable men must do dishonorable things. But even so, he knows that the Emperor's angels represent hope and salvation to the Imperials, and he opted to help those he found along the way and was a pretty radical dude. Another interesting part of the story is just how divided the Fists are regarding protecting Imperial citizens. It feels more realistic when each Marine has differing viewpoints. But anyways, moving at night when the orcs were at a disadvantage and not in full force, Pedro Cantor and crew eventually made it to the capital, and they fought through orcs at the capital city gates. At the gates, Super Chad Alessio Cortez the Immortal single-handedly fist-fought one of Snagrod's giant orc war bosses. After some power fisting and wrestling with the giant, Cortez outsmarted it and ripped its spine out. After Cortez killed the war boss, Cantor's squad finally broke through into the city and joined their fellow Fists in the defense. The defense of the city lasted for 18 grueling months, and Cantor led guerrilla strikes with his Marines while the Rinsguard PDF held the lines in the city. However, things were getting increasingly dire since, as we know, the orcs are strengthened by battle, and as the war waged, the Imperial forces dwindled and the orcs just kept getting stronger and smarter. Eventually, the orcs even began building humongo gargants, and since the Imperials didn't have the firepower to destroy these god machines, it seemed that the war for the world was lost. But luckily, the Imperial reinforcements finally arrived. The Crimson Fist's parent chapter, the Imperial Fist, as well as some other Marines, arrived along with a ton of guardsmen and much-needed titans. The fleet annihilated the orcs in orbit, and Pedro Cantor led an all-out assault with his remaining fists to liberate the planet's spaceport from the orc forces. At the port, a huge battle erupted, and Cantor demonstrated the other reason he's the best, and he fought the humongo war boss Snagrod. The two of them mag-dumped each other, but their respective force fields rendered the volleys useless, so they engaged in glorious melee combat. Snagrod was one of the biggest and strongest orcs, and unlike most war bosses, Snagrod didn't wear armor, so he was surprisingly quick. Cantor prepared for this melee by dual-wielding a power sword and a power fist, and he clashed with Snagrod's dual chain axes. Cantor unleashed a fury of powered blows, but they had no effect to the Snagrod's force field, so for a while Cantor dodged and parried while he tried to disable Snagrod's field. Eventually, he saw a module and remembered reading the ancient scripts of Dune, so he slowly stabbed at the power generator, disabling the shield. Then, Cantor and Snagrod traded some more blows. Eventually, Snagrod grabbed hold of Cantor's Crimson Fist and lifted him into the air. Cantor lunged with his sword, but Snagrod caught the blade, obliterating his own arm in the process. And then Cantor proceeded to punch the shit out of the war boss with his regular fist. After having his face pummeled, Snagrod knocked Cantor aside and ran away like a little loser guy with a broken face. Although he wasn't able to slay the war boss and exact vengeance for his ravaged home, the orc forces fell apart with Snagrod's retreat, and Cantor was able to reclaim the starport for Imperial reinforcements to come planetside and eradicate the orc menace. Shortly after his defeat at the port, Snagrod grew bored of the war before it properly ended, and he abandoned Rin's world. So, with the Imperial reinforcements, the Crimson Fist and the Rinsguard were able to defeat the remaining orc forces and liberate the planet. Then, after the battle, the troubles didn't end for the Crimson Fists as the Administratum wanted to disband the chapter since their numbers were so few, but they were dissuaded by Pedro Cantor. And them being a second founding chapter also probably helped. Cantor focused on rebuilding his chapter and mostly opted to engage in quick strike hit and run assaults in order to prevent losing more Marines. The Fist would again be decimated a bit later by demons, but luckily they received hefty Primaris reinforcements from Gilliman. And now, let's briefly mention some iconic moments from this battle. First up, after the Arch Tyrannus shot itself, the Land Raider, the Rin's Might, was left without a crew, but its powerful machine spirit possessed the vehicle, and it single-handedly, or single-treadedly, waged war against the Green Tide. After running out of ammo, the tank lured a bunch of orcs inside of it and detonated its plasma reactors, and it went out with a bang. Later on, Cantor would recognize the tank as a battle brother as well as a hero, and he would retrieve the tank's remains for repairs. It was also at this battle where the iconic Lost an Arm moment happened. At the spaceport, Super Chad Cortez fought Urzog, and after the duel, Cantor told him he was too injured for combat. But Cortez said, I'm fine, no worries. Cantor then said, you lost an arm! And the Chad Immortal said, no, I didn't. It's right over there. And he pointed to his severed arm. Literally peak cinema. And then finally, there is of course the surprisingly wholesome moment of Cantor and the Imperial woman he saved while going to the capital. If you don't want to read the whole book, I'd recommend at least looking up this excerpt. It's a very cool character moment for the chapter master. But on that note, that was the battle for Rin's World. It's a really cool battle and has a lot of cool and fun moments. Honestly, of all the battles in 40k, I think it'd be one of the best to adapt for a movie. It has a big climatic opening assault, a pivotal moment of hopelessness with a wonton missile, then it would follow the smaller scale story of Cantor's squad going to the capital with intermittent skirmishes, have a cool city defense scene, and then culminate in a huge CGI final liberation of the starport and subsequent liberation that takes up 90% of the movie's budget. Anyways though, pipe dreams aside, let me know what you think of the Crimson Fist and Rin's World, or tell me who your favorite Imperial Fist successor is. They could even cast Pedro Pascal as Pedro Cantor since he's in like every goddamn movie now. Hi friends, on this very special episode, to celebrate the 2-year anniversary of my channel, we're gonna revamp my very first video and revisit the Octarius War. This time complete with audio in not just 1, but 2 ears. Wow, how exciting. Anyways, let's go back to the past and talk about the Octarius War. Hi friends, today we're going to talk about one of the most iconic events in all of 40k, and also a huge lesson in foresight. Today we'll discuss the Octarius War. So first off, you might ask yourself, what even is this Octarius thing? I'm not familiar with all these nerd words. I have a life. Well, Octarius is just a large sector that was mostly controlled by the orcs, and there's kind of a New York situation where Octarius' capital world is called Octaria. And that's important since it's home of the Overfiend, leader of the Octarius Orc Empire. Now, the reason that Octarius became the hellhole we all know and love is mostly because of a little guy named Phidias Cryptman. Cryptman is an inquisitor belonging to the Ordo Xenos and was one of the Imperium's leading experts on Tyranids. He assisted Ultramarines during the First Tyrannic War, so he got to experience their interest in the galaxy firsthand. So when High Fleet Leviathan began destroying worlds, Cryptman devised a plan to stop them. Cryptman pulled a Russian in winter and called in exterminatus on every planet in the Tyranids' path, killing billions. However, the Tyranids didn't listen when Cryptman said that Mom told him that it's his turn on the Xbox and the exterminatuses only serve to slow the bugs. So Cryptman devised a whole new foolproof plan. And by foolproof, I mean proof that he's a fool. Cryptman knew that the Tyranids' unending numbers and adaptability would only be matched by the orcs. Both Xenos factions are notable for getting stronger, proportional to the number and strength of their opponents. Tyranids gain strength when consuming biomass and are able to bioengineer better bugs when they fight stronger opponents. Similarly, orcs grow bigger and stronger relative to how much they fight, and the more formidable their opponent, the more powerful they become. So of course, pulling a Godzilla and pitting the two in a giant unending battle totally makes sense and wouldn't lead to any consequences at all. And also, this is how I like to think that Cryptman deals with all of his problems. Pardon, Inquisitor Cryptman. We've prepared your lunch, but unfortunately some mechanic has handled it and has become heavily irradiated. Oh, that's quite alright. I'll just put this cyanide on it and that should kill the radiation. So, to kick off his schemes, Kryptman commanded some Death Watch teams onto the planet of Carpathia, which, to my utter disappointment, is not a fish planet, in order to capture some gene stealers. He then put these gene stealers onto a space hulk bound for the Octaria sector and turned the old hunk of junk into the world's largest carrot on a stick. He then casually blew up a moon and played the waiting game. Not too long after that, the space hulk arrived above an orc-controlled planet called Orok, which would kind of be like if we named the planet Human. Then, from the atmosphere, Tyranids dropped a ton of mycetic spores, leading to a lot of spore-on-spore violence. The orcs were caught off guard, but they still fought hard. However, it wasn't hard enough because the orcs were defeated and turned into biomass for the Nids. R.I.P. Orok. Due to Phidias' fiddling, the orcs and the Nids became the ultimate power couple, where they empowered each other and elevated their partner to new heights, effectively making Kryptman the ultimate matchmaker. As long as you ignore the constant abuse and violence that the two inflict on each other, of course. But with that, Octarius became a ticking time bomb in which the winner of the war will be a mega-powered menace ripe to, in technical terms, wreck shit. The Tyranids continue their process of dropping spores, dropping orcs, and taking biomass throughout the sector. However, the orcs began to fare a bit better, putting the Nids at a near stalemate since the orcs and Nids were producing troops at nearly the same rate and had a nice average KD ratio. Along with the main combatants, other factions joined in hopes of third-partying the hordes and getting an easy Vicroy. Khorne forces closed in to capitalize on the bloodshed, Imperials felt they needed to at least try to fix Kryptman's blunder, and other factions fought to prevent future catastrophes. Although they were on the back foot, the orcs began to secure some big wins. The orc Overfiend was able to kill a Swarm Lord, and Cool Kid Gazkul came to the party and brought it back to life. However, the party was short-lived as Gazkul's ADHD fired off, and he decided there weren't enough chicks at this party. Chicks being new and interesting guys to kill in this case. So, he left to seek other enemies. Then, the Hive Mind made a bigger and badder Swarm Lord and went for round 2 with the Overfiend. Unfortunately for the Greenskins, the Overfiend was bested this time and had his cunning brain brutally eaten. Afterwards, the orcs pulled a 12th century Catholic where a bunch of war bosses claimed themselves to be the new pope, Overfiend, and this inevitably led to orc infighting, and the Tyranids were able to get the upper hand and pretty much win the war. Now, Leviathan is bigger and badder than ever, and they even got a starter box with the Ultramarines, perhaps the biggest honor in all of 40k. Even more surprisingly than that, they actually beat the Ultramarines on Okram from the 10th edition campaign. And if that doesn't show their power, then nothing will. The epic clash between the orcs and the Nids is only matched by the constant battle in my heart over the cringe I have for the original Octarius video and the love I have for it for being my first and the start of the channel. I think you should still watch it though. Hi friends, some days you gotta sit down, make yourself a nice cup of tea or Mountain Dew or whatever normal people drink, take a breather, and then remind yourself that Magnus did, well, a whole lot of wrong. But also, there's no doubt that a whole lot of wrong was inflicted on the little old red man. One such wrong was having his home planet and suns razed to the ground by the second best founding chapter. So, with the awesome Space Wolf refresh and the Thousand Suns funny little robot man on the horizon, let's talk about one of the coolest and most devastating battles in the weird time period between 30k and 40k. So, technically 30k, but not the 30k you're thinking of. Today, we're talking about the Battle of the Fang. The Battle of the Fang is an iconic clash between iconic rivals and a rematch of millennium in the making. The burning of Prospero solidified the Space Wolves and Thousand Suns' burning hatred of each other, and even after the Horus Heresy ended with the Siege of Terra, the two were dead set on the annihilation of the other. Be sure to watch the faction primers on both of them after this video. Anyways though, Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, knew of the Space Wolves' hatred of him and his legion, both because of his immense psychic prowess and because, duh, of course. But being an acolyte of Tzeentch, the wily Primarch planned to use this hatred to pull a little funny on the wolves. And by little funny, I mean attempted genocide and Terrorwolfism. And I didn't just say those words to avoid YouTube flags. Unlike Corpse, these mispronunciations will be relevant. So, Magnus's ploy began with him sending visions to the Great Wolf Ironhelm, Which, by the way, if you didn't know, the Great Wolf is the equivalent of Chapter Master for the Space Wolves. But anyways, these visions were of Magnus wreaking havoc and slaughtering Imperials in hopes of goading Ironhelm into his plot. So yeah, Magnus rage baited some dude and, as the children would say, lived in his head rent-free. Quite literally too. Anyways, the troll worked and Ironhelm organized a giant witch hunt to make Mr. the Red into Mr. the Even Redder. Ironhelm had visions and gathered intel suggesting that Thousand Sun forces were doing something dark and evil on the planet of Gangiva. So he assembled nearly all of the Space Wolves save for this 12th company for an all-out assault on the world of Gangiva in order to turn the Thousand Suns into the 1,000 minus 1,000 Suns once and for all. The wolves mobilized to attack the Thousand Suns forces, but using some esoteric warp magic or something, Magnus turned the last S in Sons of Rust into an E and made a ruse. It was a ruse! And the bulk of the Thousand Suns were actually preparing an ambush of Fenris while Ironhelm was pursuing the red herring. Quite literally for the red part. So, back on Fenris, the Thousand Suns, led by Sorcerer Aphael and coordinated by Magnus, used their immense psyker powers to materialize extremely close to the world and launch a rapid assault on the Fenrisians. This assault force comprised of nearly all of the Thousand Suns who survived the heresy and millions of Spire Guard traitor forces. Magnus prioritized destroying Fenris's astropaths so that the wolves could not call for reinforcements, and in a mere hour, most of the orbital defenses and astropaths were destroyed by the Thousand Suns. Jarl Greylock took lead of the defense efforts and sent 3 ships to summon help. However, 2 of the ships were quickly destroyed, and the third disappeared into a warp. Womp womp. And to make matters even worse, the wolves' capital ship was also destroyed by the Suns. Womp womp womp. So, with his astropaths dead and ships destroyed, Greylock prepared the wolves for a last stand against the Chaos Forces planetside. While the wolves prepared their defense, the Thousand Suns established an orbital blockade and prepared to make planetfall. For their assault, the Thousand Suns employed the use of ships called Planet Scourers. The Planet Scourers were ships built to scour planets. They're like fun giant pressure washers, except instead of water, it blasts the planet with constant plasma barrages. While this softened the Space Wolf defenses and limited their tactical options, their fortress monastery of the Fang was protected by its powerful void shields and orbital defense systems. This meant that a much more interesting ground assault could commence. Which, also, little side note, it is incredibly boring when people ask, why do they engage in ground battles when they can just glass the planet from orbit? Big battle doesn't make sense. Well, the answer to that, dummies, is that, it's fucking cool. Anyways though, the Space Wolves had strike teams deployed to destroy Chaos Forces as they landed, plus Fenris is a horrible, horrible death world that does as his name suggests and creates a world of death. Thus, the Marine kill teams, monsters of Fenris, and insane weather conditions slowed and destroyed a decent chunk of the landing force. But the immense amount of Spire Guard and Thousand Suns would wear these forces thin, and they eventually fell back into the Fang to stage a final defense. The Siege of the Fang properly began a week into the invasion, and it commenced with mass artillery strikes and a giant Psyker battle! Giant Psyker versus magical but not Psyker magical wizard battle! While this was going on, Greylock ordered his men to cover the Fang in Fenrisian ruins and to wake up the big guns for the coming assault. Eventually, the Thousand Suns finally broke through the Fang's outer defenses with their demon engine gatebreakers, and the guardsmen of the Spire Guard flooded the Fang's entrance. Greylock personally fought these cultists along with his Wolf Guard and annihilated the initial waves. However, the wolves were eventually overwhelmed by the undying ranks of Rubric Marines, so they retreated further into their fortress, detonating the entrance behind them, once again walling off the Thousand Suns and buying the Fenrisians more time. By this point, the 12th Company suffered great casualties, with only 87 Marines left standing to face the seemingly endless Chaos Forces. Luckily, however, the big guns Greylock had ordered for had awoken, and the Space Wolves Dreadnoughts poured their cyber coffee and joined the defense. Of these Dreadnoughts was the dreadiest of knots, the legendary Bjorn the Fell-Handed. The legendary Bjorn advised Greylock on the defense, and the wolves once again had a chance to defend their home, or at least turn the Thousand Suns red again. Bjorn split the remaining Fenrisian forces into two groups, one led by Greylock and Bjorn, and the other led by Wolf Priest Thar Haladir, in order to defend the main choke points of the Fang. So, the Marines, the Fenrisian Guard, and whatever other staff that they had left prepared for a second defense against the Chaos Horde. Even the children of the Fang participated, erecting impromptu runes and staging distractions. Eventually, though, the Thousand Suns, with the help of their ancient cataphract robots, those are the new model reveals, by the way, finally broke through the collapsed gate and resumed their assault. Also, funny side note, it took them longer to clear out some rocks than it took them to break through Fenris's entire orbital defenses. So, maybe that's why Cadia allowed itself to fall. Chaos is apparently weak to rocks, so Cadia brilliantly transformed into a bunch of mega rocks. Yeah, that's why. That's why. Jokes and Cadia love aside, though, the real reason it took so long is that the Thousand Suns magic was severely dampened by the runes of the Fang, and the mountain that the Fang is in has inherent anti-psyker properties. Yeah, maybe use some of that magic to summon a bulldozer and some elbow grease, idiots. But with the rubble gone, the Thousand Suns engaged the wolves at the planned choke points, since, they're choke points. The Thousand Suns commander, Aphael, sent teams to destroy as many runes as possible so that their psyker energies could be more potent and so that they could do something dark and evil. After days of brutal fighting at the choke points, Aphael would not be a fail, and he successfully destroyed enough runes to weaken the wall between the Materium and the Warp enough for Magnus the Red to manifest. Unfortunately for Aphael, Magnus used a sorcerer's body as a host and killed him. So, when it comes to living, Aphael is indeed a fail. But with Magnus in the Fang, it once again seemed hopeless for the wolves. Although the runes of the Fang weakened Magnus from his full potential, he was still a humongo demon Primarch-shaped threat. Magnus slaughtered all he came across with ease, and Harladir ordered his men to retreat further into the labyrinthine Fang. The Wolf Dreads and the Fenrisian PDF stood to face Magnus while Haladir's forces prepared another defense deeper into the Fang. Additionally, Bjorn and Greylock's forces sensed Magnus's presence and went to aid their brothers in warding off the Primarch. As Magnus tore through the chapter's ancient war machines and the brave PDF, it became clear that his path of destruction was moving towards the Fang's gene labs, and it was clear that the true intent of Magnus's assault was to sabotage Harladir's gene research. As you know, or if you don't know, go watch this vid, but the Space Wolves have a gene flaw known as a Canis Helix. The Canis Helix gives them great power and abilities, but it can also lead to the Curse of the Wolfen, and it made their gene seed too unstable to create successor chapters like other Marines. Thus, the Wolf Priest Harladir had extensively studied the Canis Helix in order to remove the flaws and create a more stable version. And he was actually on the cusp of creating a cure for the Curse of the Wolfen, which would allow the Space Wolves to create successor chapters and greatly strengthen the chapter and Imperium as a whole. So, realizing Magnus's intent, Harladir rushed to his lab to defend his research. Once he was there, he was met with the Demon Primarch himself. Seeing all his cool toys broken on the floor, Harladir charged Magnus in his rage and promptly got killed. And thus, the battle was won for Magnus as he destroyed the wolves' chances of fixing their gene seed and severely threatened the chapter's existence. This blow would be felt even to the present setting as the wolves constantly struggle with maintaining their numbers. After killing Harladir, Magnus went to meet with his forces and continue the ruin of the Fang. However, on his way, he was met by Bjorn, Greylock, a rune priest, and some wolf guard, and he engaged them in glorious battle. While the wolves fought the Red King, it was revealed that the Space Wolf ship that disappeared into the warp actually survived and was able to alert the wolves of their dire home situation. And the massive Space Wolf fleet approached the Thousand Suns blockade. Back on the planet, though, the 5 legendary wolves valiantly fought Magnus. The 5 wolves actually did manage to hurt Magnus, and it is said that it was the most damage he had been since Prospero. Which, pun not intended, many think that this moment is bullshit. Mostly because it kinda is. But there are story reasons for all this, and it's not as egregious as it seems that 5 Marines could hurt Magnus in a way comparable to Lehman, Wolf, and Russ. But first, the Fang had a ton of anti-psyker runes, and the mountain itself weakened the sorcerers. Take this in contrast to Prospero, where Magnus's psyker powers would be presumably at their peak since he was on his magic nerd-ass homeworld. Secondly, Magnus fought through half of the Fang's defenses and some of the most powerful wolves in the chapter before he even met up with Bjorn and the boys. Not only would he have been weakened by combat at this point, but also, demon Primarchs just inherently lose steam in the real world unless they're constantly fueled. It's plausible that his little solo detour took him away from the slaughter long enough to depower him a decent amount. And finally, he was fighting Bjorn the freaking fell-handed. Bjorn plasma spammed Magnus while the others beat up the Primarch, but Magnus quickly overwhelmed the wolves, killing the Wolfguard and Greylock, leaving only Bjorn. Bjorn said, "Dread, not today, Red Boy," and shot him with some more plasma as he readied his titular fell hand. Back in orbit, though, most of the Thousand Sun forces actually retreated as Magnus achieved the campaign's win condition and was basically just emoting before calling it a night. So, the Wolf forces relatively easily reclaimed their orbit and deployed mass drop pod assaults to save their planet. As Marines rained from the sky, Bjorn valiantly fought Magnus, but was outmatched, and Magnus literally disarmed him and prepared a killing blow on the legendary Space Wolf hero. But then, suddenly, Great Wolf Ironhelm crashed his drop pod on the peak of the mountain, hitting Magnus and Bjorn, but mostly Magnus. With Bjorn incapacitated and Magnus severely weakened and his grasp on real space thin, Ironhelm went to punch the shit out of Magnus to banish him from the Fang. Ironhelm and Magnus traded blows and Ironhelm was killed, but he managed to weaken Magnus enough for him to vanish back into the warp. With Magnus gone, the Thousand Suns teleported away from the planet and they also callously abandoned their Spire Guard. Hey, we're doing it! We're kicking these dogs' asses! Let's go, fellas! I love you guys, we're such a great team. Guys? Hey, where'd you go? Aw, fuck my life. But anyways, after hunting down the remnant Spire Guard forces, the Battle of the Fang was finally over. The 12th Company was down to only 22 Marines, but they worked to rebuild their forces, and the Wolves crowned a new Great Wolf. And technically, the Space Wolves won the battle since they successfully defended the Fang and killed a huge amount of Thousand Sun forces relative to their own low numbers. But it's pretty clear that the Thousand Suns actually won. They achieved their main goal, effectively neutering the wolves like a puppy dog, and they landed a great blow on the chapter in their homeworld. But that was the Battle of the Fang. Although it was a crushing defeat for the wolves that would cripple them for millennia, they still had a lot of cool moments. And for being outnumbered by a factor of like 7, excluding the millions of Spire Guard, the 12th Company did one hell of a defense. And I'm sure it seems like total BS to a Thousand Suns fan, but I'm a Space Wolf fan, so screw them. Joking aside, as a consolation to any BS moments from the Wolves, at least the Suns undoubtedly won and made sure that the Wolves would never beat the furry allegations ever again. So, don't feel too bad, nerds. Anyways though, be sure to let me know what you think of this battle and why you hate the Space Wolves and /or hate the Thousand Suns. Or, let me know how much you love Bjorn the Fell-Handed, that beautiful box man. And if you think Bjorn severely hurting Magnus doesn't make any sense, you clearly haven't played Kill Team and faced the true horror that is plasma spam. Hi friends, today we're going to talk about one of the most iconic battles in all of 40k, the Siege of Vrax. This was a 17-year-long siege on the planet of, you guessed it, Vrax. It includes iconic combatants like the Kriegers, Dark Angels, Alpha Legion, and other fan-favorite factions. Now, the Siege of Rax is special to us because of how relatively unspecial it is in lore. It's really cool how we got such an in-depth breakdown of a relatively mundane battle in the 40k world. And this crazy battle was not some huge system-wide war like most other 40k battles we get coverage of. It was just a silly clash for a single city. And this really capitalizes how deadly the universe is when a battle like this is just another Tuesday. Vrax is a barren storage shed of a planet, and as an armory world, it houses a ton of weapons and supplies. Additionally, it is part of a significant Imperial supply line. If it were to be lost, then more important war zones like Pre-Falcadia would likely be short on supplies. And so, much like Mordecai's love life, trouble started with the Cardinal. Okay, interjection. Apparently, Margaret is a Robin, not a Cardinal. But, take a look at her and tell me she doesn't look like a Cardinal. She literally looks nothing like a Red Robin. Whatever, it doesn't matter. I'm talking about the religious Cardinal, anyways, not the bird Cardinal. But, back to the regular 40k content. Trouble on Brax began with the Cardinal by the name of Zaphan. But Mr. Fan wasn't always a little troublemaker. He was once a righteous, emperor-loving, violence-dealing holy man. On Vrax, people were losing faith in the Emperor, and the threat of mass heresy grew like crazy. So, as a man of the Lord, I mean a man of the Emperor, Cardinal Zaphan began a great awakening approximately 40,000 years after the last one. Alright, please the American history crowd with a shoddy reference? Check! Much like the men of America's various great awakenings, Zaphan went around giving impassioned sermons and reinvigorating religious fervor throughout the world. Unlike the men of America's various great awakenings, Mr. Cardinal Zaphan went a bit ham, and by a bit ham, I mean violently purged anyone who spoke out against him. Although Zaphan was proving to be an overall net positive in terms of imperial faith, his success was getting a bit to his head, and he started to believe that he was a mouthpiece for the emperor himself, and with a little of encouragement from his advisor, Deacon Mammon, Zaphan became even more aggressively religious. This worried the Ordo Hereticus as the Cardinal was becoming too beloved and too powerful. In addition, Zaphan really appealed to the poor working class of Vrax. And if you ever worked a minimum wage restaurant job, you could probably just imagine the horrors downtrodden, mistreated workers could unleash if instilled with even just one nicety. So just imagine the potential havoc brought on by the insane religious fervor mixed with the downtrodden, mistreated workers of 40k, who probably have it like at least 5% worse than the average customer service worker. So, to prevent Zaphan from starting a full-on class war and general unrest, the Ordo Hereticus started a full-on class war and general unrest by sending a Vindicare assassin to live up to its name and carefully assassinate the Cardinal. Unfortunately for the Ordo Hereticus and general peace and quiet, the Vindicare assassin made a Vindicare ass of himself when his assassination attempt was thwarted. Zaphan was saved by a combination of his Rosarius energy field and bodyguards. Zaphan declared the attempt on his life to be the work of heretical traitors! And the Vrax PDF was devoted to Zaphan and eliminated the Vraxian Sisters of Battle and Arbites. With the actual loyalists dead and gone, Zaphan declared himself supreme ruler of Vrax and a bastion of the loyal Emperor lovers. Hearing of the heresy in Vrax, the Imperials assembled a strike force to reclaim the planet, headed by I'm not gonna get that one right, Lord Zulki. Since Vrax was a formidable armory world, Zaphan's relatively small force would be well armed and ready for a long war of attrition. Attrition? Did I hear attrition? Oh my god! Attrition is the Death Corps of Krieg's middle name. Being masters of siege tactics and attrition warfare, the Kriegers were well suited for the upcoming Siege of Vrax. Zaphan and Mammon prepared their defenses, and the Bessies amassed an army of guardsmen, PDF, and zealous militias to protect their fortress citadel. It was about to be a real scrap. No, wrong. Orcs are not in this video. You can leave, Green Man. I spit on you. But back to the Loyalists. The Loyalist plan was to divide their forces into two groups so they could assault the heretics from two sides and divide Zaphan's smaller force into even smaller forces. And the Imperials planned for a 12-year siege in which their overwhelming forces would eventually overwhelm the enemy forces. And so the Kriegers landed and kicked off the party with a huge artillery bombardment on Zaphan's outer defensive lines. After days of shaking the earth with their Earthshakers, the Krieg launched a mass infantry assault of 500,000 men. They took extreme casualties in no man's land, but they eventually broke through and captured some trench lines. Hundreds of thousands of men spent to capture some border trenches. Sounds like a total Imperial victory to me, baby. I bet this siege will be over in no time. So, after about a year and a half of brutal fighting, the first real battle was to begin. The Loyalists sent a task force of Lehman Russes, Bane Blades, and Krieg Grenadiers. Woo! Krieg Kazarkin, let's go! Whoa! To take the fort creatively named Fort A453. And so, after some more Death Corps became Death Corps, they made a breakthrough and they took the fort. Capitalizing on their advantage, they sent Death Riders to hunt down the retreating enemy forces. This was the first major Imperial dub of the siege. After the Kriegsmen took Fort A453 in the west line, the heretics in the north fell back. The Imperials in the north began to move through the pass closer to the central fortress. As the Loyalists moved through, they were met with a large traitor counterattack. After years of being on the offensive, the Kriegers were not prepared for a huge Vraxian counterattack. The initial attack was warded off, but the Kriegs were left ragged, and the next morning they were attacked again, and the northern sector was mostly reclaimed by the traitors. This would prove a critical setback for the Imperials, and many of Lord Zoolander's plans would make like a Minecraft YouTuber and get cancelled. The ultra zealous, utterly selfless soldiers would charge into the enemy lines, get shredded en masse, and then gain some ground. And then the ultra zealous, utterly selfless soldiers would charge into the enemy lines, get shredded en masse, and then gain some ground. Then the ultra zealous, utterly selfless. So for 7 years, the two armies were at a near stalemate with thousands of soldiers dying every day. So to make the siege a bit more interesting, the Alpha Legion decided to squad up and hop into the battle. Being the Alpha Legion, they secretly snuck onto the planet to lead a surprise assault. The Alpha Legion forces were headed by Warlord Alfarius. Alfarius? Well, I don't really know. But Lord Zafan decided the best way to enact the Emperor's will was to go against the Emperor's will and team up with Chaos. This is some Magnus level of wrongness. In response to the Alpha Legion and newfound Chaos presence on Vrax, Lord Xanax called for Imperial reinforcements. Surprisingly, the Dark Angels were the first to respond. Usually, the Dark Angels are a lot like myself, that's to say, they don't go outside unless they're forced to, but for whatever reason, they came to Vrax with unusual gusto. Half of the entire Dark Angels chapter was personally led by Supreme Grandmaster Azrael, and they made a booming entrance. Literally, they orbitally bombarded the planet and flew down in Thunderhawks. They couldn't land at the main Traitor Citadel since it was too heavily defended, but that's okay because they didn't want to. The Dark Angels just had one objective: get bitches. No, wait, that can't be right. Oh, get the starport. The Angels didn't say a single word to their allies. They blew up a bunch of stuff, killed a crapload of heretics minutes upon arrival, and then they assaulted the starport. Everything was going great for the green dudes, until the blue-green dudes arrived. The Alpha Legion ambushed the Angels, and Arcos personally engaged Azrael in a epic Space Marine duel. Woo! Both Marine leaders traded blows and were heavily wounded. Arcos got the upper hand, but Azrael was saved by his Deathwing Terminators. Both Marine forces fell back, but as the Dark Angels retreated, they were able to blow up the starport on their way out, and then they abandoned the whole entire siege. Oh yay, thank the Emperor! His Dark Angels have arrived to help us! Greetings, Space Marine, how you do? Give me my spaceport! You're welcome. I have saved you, guardsman. Alright, bye now. What? With the Angels gone, Lord Ukulele sent his men to do the tried and true mass charge with artillery bombardments. Although the Kriegers were constantly taking heavy losses, they were also inflicting heavy losses, and the traitor forces were beginning to wear down. So, after almost a decade of deadly fighting, the Imperials were starting to become confident in their victory. However, Arcos had called for some of his pally pals to join in on the party, and a bunch of Chaos Marines made their way to the surface of Vrax. Khorne Berserkers assaulted the Krieg's flank. The Krieg were on the verge of securing a critical location and assaulting the traitor fortress, but they were attacked from all sides and they were forced to fall back. The Circlers became the Circlees. The Imperials were now facing Plague Marines, Iron Warriors, Black Legionnaires, World Eaters, and an assortment of freaks and weirdos. Of those freaks and weirdos were Chaos Titans. Things were about to get titanically nuts for our gas mask boys. And now the slow crawl, the front-on trench battle became a chaotic scuffle. Zafan was cucked by the Chaos forces, and he was demoted from self-proclaimed Jesus to self-proclaimed Jesus who no longer leads an army. Berserkers went berserk, Alpha Legionnaires alpha'd all around, and the Death Guard made farts so potent they could get through the Kriegers' gas masks. The Imperials desperately fought to survive as they waited for reinforcements. After weeks of getting their gas mask kick in, Marshal Kagori came to their rescue with even more Kriegers and even some Titans. Luckily or unluckily for the Imperials, depending on how you frame it, they got their asses kicked so hard that many of the Chaos Warlords figured that they already won and they left the system before Kagori even arrived. Kagori took command of the Imperials and was more aggressive than Zolki, and he wanted to end the siege once and for all. He led a huge assault creatively named the Kagori Offensive. The huge amount of guardsmen and overwhelming firepower of the Titans turned the tide of the battle, and the Imperials once again gained the upper hand. Another fun tactic Kagori pulled was sending Krieg engineers to tunnel beneath enemy lines and hit them from the back. The tunnels became one of the bloodiest war fronts in the siege, and Kriegers and Berserkers got a bit silly in the darkness. Squirm, squirm, I am a worm. Holy Emperor, that's brilliant! Wow! Along with fighting berserkers, the engineers rigged the tunnels with demo charges and blasted a breach in the traitor defensive lines. The loyalists pushed forward yet again. However, the traitors were able to defend the breach with the use of heretic ogrins. Kagori was making some progress, of course, at the cost of tons of lives. However, his progress was not fast enough, and the previous 12-year estimate had already passed. The Administratum got bored of the war since it had dragged on for so long with absolutely no Family Guy clips, so they withdrew a lot of Kagori's forces, which would cause the Imperials to once again lose momentum. Kagori called for Marine support, and the Red Scorpions heeded the call. The Scorpions only deployed 5 assault Marines into the breach, but this wasn't the all too common case of Astartes hubris and bad writing. No, there were only 5 Marines because their mission wasn't to fight the Horde. It was to deploy a teleport Homer. The Homer sparked to life, and assault Terminators materialized into the fray. The Terminators carved the traitor forces from within, while Kriegers and Marine reinforcements attacked them from the front. Once the Imperials had broken through the breach, the Scorpions ended their cameo and withdrew from their plan to recover from the heavy losses that they had endured. The Loyalists had finally secured the breach and were able to begin their final push on the traitor citadel. Things were looking up Millhouse. But, surprise, surprise, things were not up, and the Ordo Malleus foresaw an apocalyptic demon incursion on Vrax that would turn it into a demon world. After some contention with the Ordo Hereticus, the Ordo Malleus sent Mega Chad Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex to Vrax in order to prevent this grim outcome. The Guardsmen gave Inquisitor Rex control of the siege and prepared to finish the fight. Also, quick aside, Hector Rex is an absolute total beast. He's an insanely strong psyker, he's arguably physically stronger than the average Marine, and he's one of the few people to have ever witnessed the Emperor in person. Crazy. But alongside Rex, the Ordo Malleus also requisitioned Grey Knight support. So, with the combined might of the Kriegers, Grey Knights, Red Hunter Marines, and Inquisitorial armies, the Imperials prepared their final assault. Lord Rex planned to create a perimeter around the citadel and close in on the traitor forces, taking it through brute force. At first, it was going well, but the Death Guard forces stopped the Kriegers in their tracks. For like the millionth time, there was a stalemate. Then, someone had the brilliant, giga-brained idea to use chemical weapons. Yeah, chemical weapons against the dudes known for being resilient, stinky, miasma-loving little dudes. Great plan! Not! As anyone probably expected, the chemical weapons did almost nothing, if not nothing, to the Plague Marines, and it just made it even harder for the Kriegers to do their job. However, luckily for the Imperials, the Chaos Forces were getting a bit antsy-pantsy and running out of yummy foods to fill their chaotic bellies with. So, Skulltaker Zufor led a coup and claimed control of the Vraxin defense. The first order of business was killing Zaphan's most loyal followers and then locking Zaphan in a dungeon. On the Imperial end of things, Inquisitor Rex planned to assault Hangman's Hill in order to move in closer to the Citadel and disable its orbital defense lasers. After 3 assaults, the Imperials finally secured the hill, and things were once again looking up Millhouse. But, surprise, surprise, things were going to get complicated once more. The Ordo Hereticus was still mad at Malleus for not going through with the proper procedures, so they had a little fit to the High Lords of Terra. In turn, the High Lords withdrew many regiments from Rex's siege force. But Rex did not falter, and he prepared his final assault on the Citadel. As usual, they started with an artillery barrage and sent an initial vehicle assault. The initial assault had high casualties per usual, but it was enough to take down the Citadel's void shield. The Kriegers began to move into the Citadel and faced a surprisingly weak enemy defense. However, it was a trap, and the heretic forces ambushed the Kriegers. Things were also looking bad for the forces trying to capture a strategically important ravine around the Citadel. Luckily, Rex realized that ravine rhymes with marine, and he called in a Red Hunter Marine assault. The Marines shot drop pods from orbit into the ravine. But again, it was a trap, and the Chaos Forces massacred the Red Hunters on arrival. The Imperials did eventually take the ravine, but they suffered more casualties than originally planned. Which honestly, suffering more casualties than originally planned can be the slogan for this entire siege. But finally, once again, the Imperial forces moved in on the city and faced heavy resistance taking the walls. They faced Marines, cultists, and demon engines. Eventually, Inquisitor Rex personally led a Grey Knight strike force, and he finally claimed the lower gate for realsies this time. The Red Scorpions had also rejoined the battle and assaulted a different gate. They temporarily claimed the gate, but the sanctified Chaos Marines were able to successfully open a warp rift, and an army of demons reinforced the traitor forces. The Scorpions were suddenly on the defensive, but they were able to hold their ground. Team Rex also did well against the incursion, as demon hunting was the Grey Knight's middle name. So to up the ante, the mighty bloodthirster Angrath joined the fray. Angry Wrath, not to be mistaken by the other giant angry red demon, Angry Ron, tore through the Grey Knights and engaged Rex in an epic duel. Woo! Somehow, after an epic duel, woo! The absolute madman, Lord Inquisitor Rex, bested the greater demon in glorious melee combat and banished it back to the warp. Victory was in sight, and the Dark Angels returned to secretly finish their mission. The Angels of Absolution assaulted the Citadel and captured Arcos. Then, they once again fucked off to defend their title of World's Worst Teammates. But the Imperials had all but won at this point, and Rex led the Kriegers, Red Scorpions, and Grey Knights in a final purge of the Citadel. They found the once powerful Cardinal Zaffan, who was now a pathetic loser guy Chaos Spawn, and they mercy killed him. Sufer's Chaos Forces left the party early through their warp rift, but they did leave a parting gift. And by gift, I mean a demon prince. But the Grey Knights took a final fight for the road and banished the prince, sealed the rift, and finally claimed the Citadel once and for all. So after 17 years, the Imperials had finally finished the Siege of Rax. Millions of guardsmen died, hundreds of Marines, and a bunch of Titans were lost to claim the world. And it was mostly in vain anyways, as the planet was almost completely wrecked after the siege. In current times, Rax is basically just a useless wasteland with its once vast weapon stores completely exhausted during the siege. But sometimes, no, actually oftentimes in 40k, it isn't about making sense, it's about kicking ass and inspiring people. Inspiring people to buy kick-ass models, that is, because I just read the super epic thing and now I want to paint some minis. And keep in mind, even though this is probably my longest lore video, it is a very condensed version of the Siege of Vrax. I'd highly recommend reading the Imperial Armor books that Vrax is in. It's cool because it's like written like a historical record of an actual battle in universe. You'll get to see some cool maps, read about some more details, and learn about the participants some more. But yeah, that's the Siege of Vrax. Pretty epic stuff. It's funny how a lot of people view this as one of the craziest 40k battles when the point of the story is kind of just, oh yeah, this is what the typical battle might look like. The Demon Incursion kind of spiced things up, but really this is just another Tuesday for the Warhammer 40,000s. Alright, trying to counter the Plague Marines with bioweapons is probably the stupidest thing ever. Like, I've heard fighting fire with fire, but this strategy stinks. Hi friends, of all the horrible 40k planets, Armageddon might be one of the horriblest. Much like Usain Bolt, Armageddon's name became prophetic as it experienced 3 major apocalyptic wars in the present time period. I only say present time period because before Armageddon, it was called Olinor, and it was obviously one of the planets involved in the Olinor Crusade. This was one of the biggest Imperial victories during the Great Crusade and the last major battle that the Emperor personally commanded. After their victory against the Orcs, the Emperor made Horus War Master and began working on his Webway project. But we aren't talking about 30k today. Let's jump 10,000 years in the future and get back to 40k. Armageddon is a large piece of garbage planet that falls into that magic zone of the worst place ever, but it's just too darn important to delete. Just like how we can't nuke the crackhead legions and gator swarms of Florida because, well, Disney World is an important fortress, the Imperium can't exterminatus the chaos legions and orc hordes of Armageddon because it's a significant industrial hub and it's also in a very important defensive position in the galaxy. So with that little preamble out of the way, let's get right into the first war for Armageddon. This war was primarily carried out by the Force of Chaos, notably including the World Eaters. The Chaos Legions are, as their name suggests, chaotic, so they often fight each other just as much as they fight other factions. However, on one very special day, Chaos Christmas came early when a Space Hulk, Devourer of Stars, appeared on a demon world. Much like a Fortnite battle bus, this Hulk was large enough to transport all the boys into an epic battle. So, since their sweet ride pulled up, a significant Chaos Force decided to halt their infighting and beat the shit out of the Imperium instead. A huge Chaos Force mobilized and prepared for a huge scrap! No! Stop! The orcs are for later! Oh, and I also almost forgot to mention, but this force was led by a little guy you might know, Demon Primarch Angron. And if that doesn't ring a screaming bell, you might know him by his legal name, Angronius of Nucaria, Lord of the Red Sands. And if you aren't familiar with Mr. Angronius, he is an absolute total beast. Primarch's already bad news, so a mega-roided Demon Prince Primarch is even worse news. And so back to the Space Hulk, the Chaos Forces kind of took a hippie approach and kind of just let the waves take them wherever they needed to be. And they just so happened to land in a system with the name perfectly befitting an apocalyptic invasion. A big round of applause to the Warp for keeping things thematic. As the Chaotic Forces were on their road trip, the Imperials were already having a bad time in Armageddon. In the giant hive cities of the planet, the Planetary Defense Force were facing a number of revolts and general civil unrest. Luckily for the PDF, these revolts were mostly made up of malnourished, crackhead hive dwellers who probably haven't even seen the sun. So the PDF was able to deal with it without any outside reinforcements. Unfortunately for the PDF, they were able to deal with it without any outside reinforcements. Since they didn't call for any reinforcements, they would be very, very ill prepared for the incoming Chaos invasion. Hey, nice. We quelled these dang revolts. Another day, another PDF victory. What's that? That, my dear document format, would be the Space Hulk Devourer of Stars. Angron made planetfall and led his legions of Marines, cultists, demons, and assorted freaks against the region of Armageddon Prime. The PDF proceeded to have the worst day ever as Angron's armies wreaked havoc across the lands, killing millions of Imperials shortly upon arrival. After some desperate fighting, the survivors fell back through the jungles into a secondary region, creatively named Armageddon Secondus, since it was second to Armageddon Prime, which was the first. And luckily for the Imperials, Angron was too busy emoting after his victory at Armageddon Prime, and he wasted valuable time erecting monuments to his victory and celebrating. In this time, the Imperials were able to regroup and the Space Wolf reinforcements finally arrived. Led by the legendary Logan Gribnar, the PDF, Steel Legion, and Space Wolves prepared their defenses for Angron's approaching armies. It was said that the Wolves were outnumbered 1,000 to 1, but luckily for them, they were fighting the World Eaters, not the Wolf Eaters. To even the odds, Grimnar led a daring assault on the World Eaters and lured them into a jungle trap in which the Wolves and Steel Legion killed a bunch of Marines. Afterwards, the Wolves attacked the weakened Chaos Force in an epic Berserker on Berserker river battle. Despite the Wolves making some progress against the Hordes, Angron was able to break through their defensive lines and make his way towards the Hive's Hell's Reach and Infernus. Hell's Reach will be more important later on, so keep it in mind. Realizing that Angron's worth 415 points while he's only a measly 145 points, Grimnar knew how absolutely hopeless it would be to fight the Demon Primarch, so he called for some Grey Knight reinforcements. The Grey Knights are a super secret, ultra elite anti-demon chapter of Space Marines, so of all the Marines, they had the best shot at vanquishing Angron. So, before Angron could make it to the Hive Cities, the Grey Knights teleported right in the center of his army and attacked the Primarch, while the Wolves led a final counterattack along with the Steel Legion. Angron was able to kill the Knights with relative ease by stroking his ginormous black blade. With strokes of his black blade. But luckily for the Knights, they had a named character amongst their ranks, and a knight named Hyperion used the power of faith, will, and friendship in order to shatter the black blade, which significantly weakened Angron. The Knights pushed their advantage, and Grey Knight Captain Aurelian began to banish Angron. As he was being banished, the Demon Prince struck a mortal blow on the captain. But banishing Angron wasn't even the coolest thing Aurelian did that day. As Angron was being banished, he taunted Aurelian by saying how the captain's soul would be eaten by demons forever and ever. Tee-hee-hee. But Aurelian just said to this, "So be it," and then blasted Angron into Shadow Realm. After Angron was banished, the demons weren't able to hold their material form and dissipated back into the warp. The remaining cultists, Marines, and freaks were either killed or sent running by the Imperials. The Marines and Guard worked together to hunt down the Chaos Remnants, thus closing off their first war for Armageddon. Despite their victory, the Imperials suffered heavy losses, especially the Grey Knights, who only had 13 survivors out of the 109 sent. To make matters worse, the Inquisition arrived and ruined the celebration party. They deemed the Chaos exposure to be a threat and sent all the guardsmen and Imperial citizens who just heroically fought off a giant mega demonic invasion to work camps where they were sterilized and worked to death. Additionally, the Inquisition purged Imperial forces that tried to leave the planet. The Space Wolves took issue with this since they wanted to protect the people who fought alongside them. This led to a little thing called the Months of Shame, where the Wolves challenged the Inquisition and had a few bloody disagreements, but that's a video for another day. About half a century later, Armageddon lived up to his name once again as a massive orc wah headed by the legendary war boss Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka made its way to the Imperial world. Much like Angron, Gazkul is bad news. He is the prophet of the wah chosen by Gorkamork themselves, so once again, Armageddon was ultra mega boned. To make even worse for them, the Space Hulk that Gaz and friends were riding on was really janky and it regularly got attacked by demons, which, for anyone else, would have been the end of their little trip, but for Gaz it was just a pregame. You see, orcs get stronger proportional to the might and number of opponents that they fight, so this was literally just XP grinding before the real WAH began. So then finally, a second apocalyptic Space Hulk arrived in Armageddon. The orcs destroyed the orbital defenses and made planetfall. Quite literally, as the Hulk fell from space onto the planet, along with orc ships called rocks, which are asteroids that the orcs carved nice little chairs in and strapped like a million guns to. The initial landing caused major damage to Armageddon Prime, and the Hulk itself completely destroyed Hive Ulfern. Then, to make matters even worse, there was a convenient warp storm that prevented Imperial reinforcements. Then, to make worse, even worse, the Imperial Governor of Armageddon, Hermann von Straub, is perhaps the stupidest guy in the world and failed every single intelligence check he possibly could. When his advisors told him that they foresaw an orc invasion, he said, "No worries, I got that dog in me," even though he most definitely did not have that quote-unquote dog in him. Then, when ultra badass hero of the Imperium, Sebastian Yarrick, rightfully sent out a distress signal, crayon connoisseur Hermann banished Yarrick to Armageddon Secondus. The orc assault was relentless, and they were quickly overwhelming the forces of Armageddon Prime. The local PDF desperately tried to hold the line, but were broken nonetheless. So the Imperials once again had to fall back to Armageddon Secondus, which, if you remembered, absolute Chad Yarrick was recently banished to. So, there's still hope. But, once again, the orcs broke through the Imperial defenses and made their way towards Hive Hades. Luckily, the Imperials had the Iron Skull's Titan Legion to fight back the Greenskins. Unluckily, they were commanded by Glue Guzzler Hermann. Hermann ordered them to go into the middle of the fucking horde. The middle of an orc horde. The orcs, one of the iconic melee factions. Yeah, you Titans, you guys have ginormous cannons that basically shoot sunbeams and 1 trillion bullets. But yeah, go in the middle of the orc horde. Yeah, so this moron basically said, "Big sword go burr." And then he sent the Titans into the middle of the largest orc horde he could find and basically said, "Alright, do your due. Kill them all, please." In the battle, the Titans did quite well, all things considered, and killed many orcs. But they were eventually overwhelmed up close by the orc Gargants. The commander of the Iron Skulls, Curtis Mannheim, was an absolute beast and took down 3 Gargants all by himself before finally being critically wounded. Knowing it was over for him, he overloaded his Titan's reactor and caused a huge explosion that killed millions of orcs and gave the Imperials valuable time to regroup. Although the Titans were out for the rest of the war, Yarrick took charge of Hive Hades' defenses and prepared for the biggest battle of the war. Yarrick recruited the various gangers of the Hive and assembled a sizable army. The remaining orc Gargants bombarded the Hive while the invading force gathered to prepare for their assault. Soon after, Brainworms Hermann remembered that his family had a reserve of virus bombs that might just be useful against a giant invasion. He rushed the bombs into missiles and triumphantly redeemed himself when his plan went perfectly and he killed all the orcs. Everybody said, "We're sorry for calling you stupid, Hermann. You were right all along. You are the true hero of the Imperium. You shall now be henceforth known as Hermann the Hero, Imperial Saint." Yarrick is an idiot, he was executed, and then Hermann went on to single-handedly slay Ghazghkull, Abaddon, and the Silent King, and he brought peace to mankind. Haha, no, I'm just fucking with you. Just like his other plans, this one mostly failed as the bombs and missiles were super old and had some performance issues. To his credit though, the bombs did kill a fair bit of orcs, just not enough to stop the assault. It was at this time that horrible Hermann became the most relatable 40k character, and he went to his room to cry about his failures. On the other end of the competency spectrum, Yarrick was leading the Imperials at Hive Hades, and they were valiantly repelling the orc advances. With the bulk of the attacks being foiled, Ghazghkull stepped in to personally coordinate the attacks on the Hive. Gaz came up with a ton of strategies, some of which were even said to be told directly from Gork and Mork. He created huge siege weapons. He sent elite commando infiltration teams into the Hive's vents. He created even huger siege weapons. But, time after time, his plans were foiled by Yarrick, so Ghazghkull sent one of his mightiest war bosses to kill the Commissar. War boss Ugelhard wrecked the perimeter defenses and eventually engaged Yarrick in a duel. The war boss cut off Yarrick's arm, but Yarrick passed the feel no pain rule and decapitated Ugelhard with his chainsword. The absolute crab Chad Yarrick held up the severed power claw, and then the remaining orc forces retreated in horror. Just imagine how much of an absolute Chad Yarrick is for not only defeating a war boss in melee, but then using his iron balls and indomitable will to send a bunch of orcs pissing and crying away in fear. Meanwhile, in Hive Acheron, one of the only other surviving hives, the Imperials readied their defenses. They were ill-equipped and ragged, but they were inspired by Yarrick's ongoing defense of Hive Hades. Dum Dum Hermann also sent something nice. He sent them good luck wishes and 20 dudes to help defend the Hive. But the Hive's governor was not deterred, and he prepared for the incoming horde. The Orcs led a massive frontal assault on the Hive when they were suddenly blasted from orbit. Space Marine reinforcements had finally arrived. The Blood Angels, Salamanders, and Ultramarines had turned the tide of the Battle of Acheron, and they secured the first Imperial victory of the war. Dante of the Blood Angels assumed control of the Imperial forces on planet, and contrary to all reason, Pinhead Herman was angered at the Space Marines' arrival since he, quote-unquote, had it all under control. Dante said, "I'm too old for this shit," and he arrested Herman. Eventually, Dimwit Herman did manage to escape on a land speeder, but of course he crashed like a moron. However, his core was never found. Back in Hades, Gaskell was finally making some progress as he ramped up his efforts and the Hive was running out of supplies and morale. Dante attempted to assassinate the war boss, but his efforts had failed. However, in one of the bloodiest battles of the Second War, the Marines were able to take back Hive Tartarus. In this battle, the Orcs ran out of ammo and had to resort to full-on Oonga Boonga caveman tactics, using rocks and melee weapons to survive. In this battle, Gaskell was also supposedly killed when he got shot in the face with a bolter, but his body was never found, which, in literary terms, means he didn't die and he'll be back later. So don't worry, Orc fans. With Gaz out of the picture, the remaining Orc forces faltered and the Imperials were able to gain the upper hand. Hive Hades was eventually conquered by the Orcs for a short time, but the Marines made their way to the Hive in order to aid the Imperial remnants. Only a few survived, and Yarick was found kicking amongst a bunch of slain Orcs. Gaskell, who was of course not dead, made one final attempt to take the planet, but he ultimately failed and decided to retreat to his space hulk so he could regroup his forces. After Gaskell left, the Imperials basically just cleaned up the rest of the Orcs and they retook Armageddon Prime, successfully defending the world yet again. Gaskell decided that this was a mere practice run and he prepared for a sequel. Speaking of sequels, you may have noticed I only talked about 2 wars in this video, even though I said there were 3 major wars. But don't worry, I do know how to count. However, this video would have been way too long if I covered all 3 of them, so I'll cover the 3rd war for Armageddon, along with the legendary battle of Hell's Reach in next week's video, so stay tuned for part 2 of the Wars for Armageddon. And with that, I hope everyone enjoyed this week's video. The Wars for Armageddon are some of the most iconic battles in 40k, and they have some of the coolest characters. Yarick, Gaskell, and Angron are all super iconic and formidable foes, which makes for some awesome stories. Oh, and how can I forget, Simpleton Herman, true hero of the Imperium, was there too. Man, I wish we could just get a Simpleton Herman von Straub model. He'd cost like 200 points and he'd have a 12-inch debuff aura. Ah, a man can dream. Hi friends, so far we talked about 2 reasons why you shouldn't name your planet Armageddon, both of which were massive apocalyptic wars. So, today I'll talk about the 3rd reason, which, again, is a massive apocalyptic war. After his defeat in the Second War for Armageddon, Gaskell Mac Uruk Thraka, prophet of the Wah, began to regroup his forces. Unlike most Orcs, Gaskell isn't a complete dumbass meathead. Half his head is metal after all, not meat. And he's actually a very skilled tactician. As such, he knew that his defeat at Armageddon was an invaluable teaching moment, and he devised new strategies with lessons born of his loss. But, as he prepared, he began to doubt whether or not he should actually go through with his plans, as he began to have visions from Gork and Mork suggesting that they may not want him to return to the planet. Along with this, Ultra Chad Grot Makari also told Gaz maybe he shouldn't go back to Armageddon. But despite the literal gods, and also Ultra Chad Makari telling him not to, Gaz just killed Makari and decided to invade Armageddon once more. Largely in part because his pal, Mad Doc Grotsnick, told him, you know, it'd be really dang cool to do it. So Gaz prepared once more for his Wah. And in his preparations, he also recruited war boss Nazdreg Urgrub. Nazdreg would prove very useful later on, as he had access to a lot of teleporter technology that would be devastating in the upcoming war. And so one of his last significant preparations was to take over the planet of Golgotha in order to get resources and manufacture equipment for his upcoming Wah! Gaskell easily took over the cities and factories of the planet, converting them into Orc slave factories. However, he was intercepted by Crab Chad and coolest guy ever, Sebastian Yarick. Yarick led a squadron of Baneblades with his own personal Baneblade, the Fortress of Arrogance. Despite riding the coolest vehicle ever with one of the coolest names ever, Yarick was eventually overrun and surrounded. Yarick was then taken to Gaskell's Space Hulk and tortured for weeks. However, after some fun times torturing Yarick in his dungeon, Gaskell decided to release the legendary commissar because he fell in love with him. I mean, he wanted Yarick to give him a good time. I mean, a good fight. You know what? Never mind. Who am I kidding? Gaskell was definitely 100% in love with Yarick. So, 7 years later, Gaskell finally returned to his murder bestie and finally launched his second assault. The Greenskin fleet was the largest fleet to ever assault an Imperial world, and it greatly outnumbered the Imperial forces. They easily broke through the naval blockades, and they made their way to the planet's surface. Hearing of Gaskell's arrival, Yarick hurriedly prepared his defense force, which comprised of Guardsmen, Titans, Sisters of Battle, and a bunch of Space Marine chapters, one of which being the legendary Black Templars. Once again, the orcs literally made planetfall and rocks crashed into the planet. Additionally, Gaskell shot a giant asteroid at Hive Hades, completely annihilating the hive that Yarg so doggedly defended half a century earlier. The rocks that crashed into the planet were fitted with teleporters, and Gaskell quickly teleported troops and equipment from space to the planet in mere moments in order to overwhelm the Imperial defenses. Across the world, huge battles waged. Imperials faced unending waves of orcs. Feral orcs from the First War came out of hiding to scrap. Titans battled Gargants. Yarg dramatically looked at the camera and he said, "Gulp. Now this is truly Armageddon." One of the first hives assaulted by the orc forces was Hell's Reach. The battle for Hell's Reach is one of the most iconic battles in all of 40k and one of the most devastating Space Marine last stands. The Black Templars sent 100 Templars from their crusading fleet in order to aid Armageddon, which, honestly, seems a bit low to me, but GW isn't really known for their number skills, so whatever. But the Marines fortified Hell's Reach alongside the Guardsmen and Sisters of Battle. Grimaldus led strike teams to kill some of the initial orc forces. However, when the bulk of the horde arrived, the Templars hunkered down within the city walls. Imperial Navy bombers thinned the approaching green tides, and the Imperial gunlines would attempt to pick off the surviving orcs. Requiring more firepower, Grimaldus sent his Master of the Forest to seek out an ancient weapon called Oberon. Oberon was a massive war machine called an Ordinatus engine. Its main strength was its humongous Nova cannon. This cannon was usually equipped on Imperial Navy battleships, and its devastating blast could literally one-shot Titans. After some time, the orcs amassed their largest force yet. Millions of orcs alongside hundreds of Gargants and vehicles assaulted the hive walls once again. The massive horde was met with airstrikes and the Titan Legion, Legio, and Vigilata. Eventually, the overwhelming number of orcs broke through the defensive lines and flooded the hive. After about a month of brutal combat, the orcs had gained control of the majority of Hell's Reach. However, there were still Imperial holdouts going strong. In addition to the ground forces, the orcs also had submarines assaulting the docks of Hell's Reach, bombarding the hive and sending in extra troops. The Black Templars desperately fought on the docks and were beginning to falter when drop pods burst through the clouds above and barraged the city streets. It was the Salamanders, here to aid their battle brothers and turn the tide of the dockside din. Ordered by Yarg, the Imperials spread out and created fortified holdouts throughout the city in order to hold the hive as long as possible. As their forces whittled, the Imperials were about to be whittled even more, like a lot more. You know what? Whittling is kind of too small of a word for this, because super mega giant huge mega gargant named Godbreaker arrived in the city to crump some humans! Godbreaker was even bigger than the Imperial Titans, including the Imperator Titans. Imperator Titans are those humongoid Titans with freaking churches on their backs. Or, at least they're supposed to be giant humongoid Titans, when in reality they're only like 50 meters tall, which is only really as tall as like the Leaning Tower of Pisa or Godzilla, the original one. Yeah, I mean, like, that's tall, but I don't know if it's tall enough for a titanic god machine, you know? But you know what? My girlfriend tells me that size doesn't matter, so let's just move on. The only thing that could even hope to compete with the gargantuan Gargant was the Imperator Titan Storm Herald. However, Storm Herald was badly damaged and worn out, so it was only capable of one shot. Me too, buddy. Me too. But you know what? It's like when you and the boys are on Fortnite, it's down to the last guy, only your buddy's still alive, it's a 1v1 for the Vicroy. He steadies his purple sniper, takes aim, you're all waiting for him to kill the last dude. He takes a breath, he shoots, he fucking misses, and then gets lasered by the opponent, and you call him the worst things possibly imaginable. That is exactly what happened with Storm Herald. It whiffed its one shot and immediately got killed by Godbreaker! After many hard battles, only 35 Black Templar remained. Led by Grimaldus, they made their last stand in an Imperial temple. Along with some Sisters of Battle and Guardsmen, they desperately held the cathedral, knowing that the end was nigh. But they had one last hope. Super Mega Chekhov's gun Oberon. The war engine was awoken and it prepared to fire. 2 Warhound Titans sacrificed themselves to hold down Godbreaker, and the massive cannon obliterated the troublesome Gargant, giving the Imperials one last chance. Although the Orc Titan was taken out, the cathedral was eventually overwhelmed and collapsed on the Imperial and Orc forces fighting within. The only survivor of this final battle was Grimaldus as he emerged from the desecrated building. Oh, and while this was all happening, Hive Akron also suddenly fell into Orc hands. However, the Hive didn't fall due to a huge Orc assault. It fell because everybody's favorite war criminal, Half-Brain Herman. But this time the Hive didn't fall due to his tactical incompetence. It fell because this motherfucker teamed up with the damn Orcs to overthrow the Hive from within. Yeah, go crazy with that one, Power Scalers. PP Herman was able to make Hive Akron fall almost by himself. It took the stupid Orcs a giant army, and they never even got it in the First War. Food for thought. However, despite their huge losses, the sacrifices made at Hell's Reach were not in vain, as they distracted a large Orc force long enough that the planet's natural season of fire could begin. The season of fire is a series of insano storms that overtake the planet every so often. It's like the storm scene in Fury Road, except it's practically planet-wide. The battle for Hell's Reach also leads to a super cool moment where Grimaldus realizes the value of humanity and that the Space Marines' true strength isn't their capacity to kill, it's the power that they have to inspire hope within humanity against the horrors of the galaxy. But enough of that silly, quote-unquote, emotion stuff. Let's get back to the war and killing. Where were we? Oh yeah, the Season of Fire. These storms are so bad that even the orcs don't want to go outside. And this brief respite from the orcs allowed the Imperials to reconvene and strengthen their defenses. And from this, Yarg was able to once again gather his forces for a counterattack. Additionally, the Last Chancer's Penal Legion hunted down Harebrained Herman, finally putting an end to the legendary figure. The Imperials engaged the orcs on many fronts. Catachan and Armageddon orc hunters, as their name suggests, hunted orcs in the equatorial jungles. Marine dreadnoughts got in dreadful mech battles with death dreads, and the huge wastelands were raised as Imperials and Greenskins clashed on the battlefield. The two massive forces were at a stalemate, and you know who really hates stalemates? Ghazghkull does. He finds them incredibly stale, mate. And so the board prophet resurrected Makari. Makari's 40k Jesus confirmed? Huh? And a little side tangent because I think it's funny. For whatever reason, Ghazghkull can just touch any random grot, say, hey, you're Makari now. And then all of Makari's memories enter the grot, forging a new Makari. Kind of like an Eldar Exarch, except better because Makari's the best character in the setting. And so after resurrecting his little buddy, Ghazghkull said, hey, listen, man. I won't apologize for things I did. That would be like hella lame. However, I guess like technically you were right. So, sorry, not sorry, but I love you, bro. I shouldn't have killed you. So like, let's blow this popsicle stand and start a different holy war. When suddenly a Lehman Russ battle tank Kool-Aid Man into the room and blasted Ghazghkull. Best character ever, Makari doesn't let dudes mess with his bros, and he climbed into the tank, murdering the entire crew. Seeing the giant flaming hole in his chest as a giant flaming sign from the gods that he was wrong, Ghazghkull announced his departure from the world, and he would go on to start the Great War. And so after the war boss left, Yarg and some Black Templars followed Ghazghkull in hopes of killing him once and for all. Even with Ghazghkull's departure, the orc forces still fought and war raged on almost endlessly. Armageddon essentially became Disneyland to the orcs as the endless war became known as Ragnarok, and it was a place where the orcs could make holy pilgrimage in order to have a good old time crumping some humies. Billions of Imperials died defending the world, and the death toll continues to grow. However, the planet is far too important to fall, so the Imperium is willing to make some tremendous sacrifices in its defense. Sometime later, once Cadia had fallen and the Great Rift tore the galaxy asunder, Armageddon was invaded by Chaos forces once again, making this hellhole a literal hellhole. And it was so bad at times that the orcs even teamed up with the Imperials to fight some demons. Half the world became demonic, and an endless three-way war rages on in the present setting. And that concludes the Wars for Armageddon. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this two-part series. Armageddon is truly one of the coolest settings in 40k. Along with that, the Battle for Hell's Reach is a really cool story in and of itself. Grimaldus' journey and learning about the value of humanity and what the Space Marines truly represent is really powerful, so I definitely give that a read. But with that, that concludes the Wars for Armageddon. Herman and Makari would solo the Emperor so easily, like, thank God this chick in a miniskirt put an end to Herman before that could happen. Hi friends, Knights vs Vikings, who wins? Well, that's a ridiculous question as hockey and football skills are hardly comparable. Like, how would that even work? It's just plain silly. Oh wait, this is 40k, we don't know sports, sorry fellas. But Knights vs Vikings is a long debated and fascinating question to many. So, why not apply it to the ever awesome setting of Warhammer 40,000? Plus, we get the epic trope of faction civil wars. So, let's get right into the Months of Shame. The Months of Shame is one of the most well-known Imperial conflicts and was a cool little clash between the ever-awesome Super Chads, the Space Wolves, and the dumb silly heads, the Grey Knights, as well as their scumbag inquisitorial handlers. Yep, too late, Grey Knight fans. I depicted the dudes I like as cool Chads and the ones I don't as silly fools. Yup, I'm a guard simp, I'm a Space Wolf simp, Grey Knight bad. But anyways, coming off the heels of the apocalyptic First War of Armageddon, the people of Armageddon were celebrating their triumph over the chaotic hordes and were beginning to rebuild their planet. However, the Inquisition decided in a vote to metaphorically poop on the party and condemn the population of Armageddon as well as the guardsmen who fought in the war to extremely harsh containment protocols due to chaos exposure. The Inquisition, led by Lord Inquisitor Cisneros, told the civilians that they would be relocated to temporary camps while the cities were cleansed of corruption. But, boom! Surprise slave labor camps and secret sterilization. How fun. Furthermore, the Grey Knights were ordered to destroy any Imperial Guard transport ship that was leaving the planet. Boom! Surprise betrayal. How fun for a second time. But luckily, the ultra mega Chad Logan Grimnar was wary of the Inquisition's conduct and remained in Armageddon void space for a little bit longer to monitor them. And upon seeing them kill the Imperials that fought so valiantly to protect the world, he stepped in with the wolves to protect the ships and escort some off planet. While the Inquisition's wariness regarding the people exposed to chaos was not wholly without merit and reason, Demon Primarch Angron did make a little appearance after all. The Space Wolves still believed them to be overstepping. You see, during the war for Armageddon, the Space Wolves, being the cool dudes they are, made a direct effort to minimize chaos exposure to civilians and guardsmen. In the war, the wolves would risk greater casualties to themselves in order to fight with fewer guard reinforcements and to protect whole hives from ever being exposed to chaos in the first place. So, the Inquisition was purging a lot of people who didn't even witness chaos at all. Plus, them being worried about the news of a demon Primarch shaking the Imperium, since now people know that some Primarchs turned traitor, is honestly pretty damn stupid. Like, what kind of normal human is gonna actually recognize Angron as a fallen Primarch, let alone even know who Angron is? Plus, you can't tell me that the average Imperial can tell the difference between this and a greater demon. Like, yeah, Angron can corrupt harder than normal demons, but worrying about word getting out of the Primarchs is a bit dumb. And yeah, I know they're pretty much just stacking reasons to justify their actions, but I don't know, that one thing has just always struck me as dumb. But anyways, in addition to that, the Space Wolves also greatly valued those with a warrior spirit and skill. So, to see the guardsmen who bravely and skillfully fought alongside them unceremoniously killed by the Inquisition also just really pissed them off. So, as ships left Armageddon, Kisnaros ordered the Grey Knights to destroy any guard ship leaving the planet and to exterminate any space station or worlds that the ships docked at. And while this was happening, Space Wolves continued to try and defend guardsmen and other targets of the Inquisition. Notably, they would never open fire against the Inquisitorial vessels, even when the Inquisition would just straight up shoot them. They did this so that the Inquisition wouldn't have solid reason to declare them renegade. Typical Space Wolf W. And this Cold War went on for months. Hence the months and the months of shame. And as it wore on, the Inquisition began to feel that Kisnaros' efforts were not worthwhile, and Kisnaros himself was worried about the Space Wolves' growing ire. So he organized a parley with Grimnar. But the conniving Inquisition and the bastard Grey Knights, of course, had secret plans. And the Grey Knights' Grand Master Joros had convinced Kisnaros that he should threaten the Space Wolves into submission and capture Grimnar as a show of power and authority in order to end the conflict swiftly. He literally said that they need to be alpha males and assert their dominance. Typical Grey Knight L. Even Hyperion, one of the few cool Grey Knights, remarked that the Space Wolves are too base to care about silly shit like that and are the true alphas. But Kisnaros is no Hyperion, and he fired upon the Space Wolves after lying about a peaceful negotiation, destroying some Space Wolf ships and crippling Grimnar's flagship. In response, Grimnar agreed to teleport onto the Grey Knight ship to meet the Lord Inquisitor and Joros face to face. On the ship, Grimnar and his elite Wolf Guard condemned the Inquisition and the Grey Knights' cowardly tactics and their bold-faced deception. He called for the coward who ordered the attack to step forth, and the instant that Joros admitted that it was his idea, Grimnar cut him down with his badass power axe. The Wolf Guard and Lord Wolf then killed the Grey Knight Justicars, who tried to retaliate and scared the shit out of Kisnaros, who promptly let them leave. After this encounter, furious and disgusted by the underhanded and dishonorable conduct of the Inquisition and Grey Knights, Grimnar and the Wolves destroyed any Inquisition and Grey Knight ship they came across on sight, uncaring and unafraid of the consequences, since at this point the Inquisition and their goons proved that they wouldn't be honorable anyways. And as the conflict escalated, the Greater Inquisition began to disapprove of Kisnaros' actions and were unsure about the repercussions of coming into conflict with the Space Wolves due to their legendary reputation and first founding status. Kisnaros was scrambling to find a way out of the conflict that would both avoid the wrath of the Space Wolves and save face for the Inquisition. On one hand, he had to show consequences for defying him and the Inquisition, and on the other, escalating the conflict with the Space Wolves could potentially lead to a civil war, one that may have been even worse than something like the Badab War, since the Wolves would likely be able to garner a lot of support thanks to their status alone. So, the Lord Inquisitor called upon the Red Hunters chapter and Grey Knights to join him in occupying Fenrisian void space, and there he would set up another negotiation, this time with Hyperion and canonical hot babe Inquisitor Jarl's daughter. He brought these two funky characters since the Space Wolves respected Hyperion for his honorable conduct on Armageddon and the fact that he played a pivotal role in banishing Angron. And if you couldn't tell from her name, Jarl's daughter was a Fenrisian native and had some rapport with the Space Wolves. Having the two respectable figures would theoretically prevent another axing and would hopefully demonstrate some good faith. Once arriving on Fenris, they encountered only one damaged ship in orbit defending the world, and they met the Wolves at a Fenrisian spaceport. However, instead of Grimnar, Cassandros and his friends were greeted by the Ultra Mega Chad Bjorn the Fell-Handed. Jarl's daughter immediately recognized the legend and burst into tears at his presence. Hyperion recognized him a little bit later, and then had to tell Kisnaros who he was because, well, Kisnaros is a bit of a dum-dum head sometimes. And with that, the Lord Inquisitor shat his pants again as Bjorn confirmed that he was in the game Warhammer 30k and had fought alongside and also pissed alongside the Emperor himself. That pissing being very important, of course. Anyways, though, negotiations began and Kisnaros demanded that the Space Wolves end their aggressions and do a penitent crusade to repent for their defiance. Otherwise, the Inquisition would exterminatus their homeworld of Fenris, and to that, Bjorn said, "Nuh-uh," and continued to say, "Nuh-uh," until it became clear that the Space Wolves would not submit to the Inquisition. And this was all a trap. Bjorn was simply delaying until Grimnar could ambush the Inquisitorial forces with his hidden fleet and eventually engage them in a void battle in response to Kisnaros threatening to exterminatus the planet. Kisnaros frantically teleported back to his ship to lead his fleet, and after both sides took heavy losses, the Space Wolves finally took down Kisnaros' flagship's void shields, and Logan Grimnar teleported aboard with a large force of Terminators and Inquisitor Jarl's daughter. Logan and the boys cut through stormtroopers and Grey Knights until they got to Kisnaros, and Grimnar sprinted at the Lord Inquisitor and promptly killed the hell out of him. And before the Wolves could kill Hyperion and the other crewmates, Bjorn teleported aboard and called for Logan to stop fighting. He commanded Jarl's daughter, who is now the highest ranked Inquisitor, to tell the Inquisition to never return to Fenris and to end this foolish conflict. Otherwise, the Wolves would beat him up a second time. And he also told Hyperion to tell the Wolves of the Grey Knight's secrets before he would be released. And with that, the months of shame were over. However, Grimnar would forever hold a grudge against the Inquisition for their dishonor and for ravaging their world. Additionally, both sides took heavy losses, which were especially devastating after the losses taken on Armageddon. And overall, I think this is a very cool conflict, as I always like to see infighting within the Imperium since it demonstrates the dysfunction of their government, and Civil War stories are always fun. Plus, I also just like stories of the Imperium being overtly evil bastards, since that part tends to fly over some people's heads. Also, I'm obviously highly biased, as the Space Wolves are my favorite chapter and the Grey Knights are my least favorite. But in my opinion, the Grey Knights did act very dishonorably and spineless throughout this whole conflict. And even though they were conflicted with taking Cassandros' orders, they still did it and were sneaky bastards on multiple occasions. I also kinda hate when Grey Knight glazers say it's impossible that the Space Wolves could beat Grey Knights and that there are Mary Sues in the story. Both sides took heavy losses, so they aren't really Mary Sues, and at the end of the day, Grey Knights are still Space Marines. Thanks to the usual bad and inconsistent Grey Knight writing, a lot of people think that they're closer to Custody level than Space Marine level, but in reality, they're just psychic Space Marines. Certainly powerful, don't get me wrong, but against one of the most powerful anti-psyker chapters who also specialize in Marine-on-Marine combat, they aren't gonna have a stroll in the park. But, of course, I encourage you to read from the source and form your own opinions. I'm just one dude at the end of the day, and it's just my opinion. Basically, all the Months of Shame lores in the Emperor's Gift novel, so it's not very hard to find. But yeah, let me know what you thought about the Months of Shame and who do you side with in this little Imperial kerfuffle. Also, Grey Knight fans, feel free to comment how the Space Wolves are bastard man and why you hate. It's only fair after I voiced my hatred for your boys. Also, by the way, sorry if my voice sounds tired in this one. It's mostly like that because, well, because I'm tired. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and share to all your Armageddon veteran besties. Thanks. Hi friends, thanks to the Space Marine game, I have ascended to full Games Workshopness and have recently been on a bit of an Ultramarine kick. Additionally, one of the factions that hasn't got much love on the channel yet are the Tyranids. So what better event to talk about than the Imperium's first encounter with the Nids, the First Tyrannic War. So before kicking this off, I should mention the first actual encounter with the Tyranids was on the moons of Yumgarl, where some Imperials saw the tentacle-faced Gene Stealers. However, these Xenos were not recognized as Tyranids at the time, and they were quickly purged by the Salamanders. The first encounter with the Tyranids where they were properly identified was when an Imperial explorer fleet led by Magos Veranak was doing a planetary census around Tyran. Tyran is an oceanic world in the Ultima Segmentum, which is the same segmentum as Ultramar, if you couldn't tell from the name. And Ultramar is where the Ultramarines are from, if you couldn't tell from the name. Now, Tyran was a relatively unimportant world, but it was notable for having some heavily armed fortresses, since the local Imperials would regularly be attacked by the dangerous sea monsters of the world, which, also, I just want to say, before I even learned of Tyran, I made my homebrew regiment's home planet to have basically the same sea monster shtick, and I thought I wrote something super cool and unique, it's never been done before, just to later read about this stupid planet that was pretty much exactly the same as mine. Ugh! But back to the planetary census. The explorers carrying out the census had found the once thriving worlds around Tyran were now completely devoid of life, even down to the microscopic level. The dead plants were reported, but due to the area's relative unimportance, it was ignored. And I thought these plants were Imperial, not Dark Eldar, am I right, boys? Although Tyran was treated like the Votan range and didn't get much support, it had a particularly formidable fortress on one of its islands, and the planetary governors and explorer team were able to bolster a pretty well-mounted defense. This fortress, called Tyran Primus, had 4 huge orbital defense lasers along with a crapload of autocannons and las cannon point defense turrets. In addition to the guns, the fortress had a ground force composed of Skitarii warriors and a regiment of veteran Catachan jungle fighters. So, pretty badass stuff. But the Tyranians were about to wish they had the Catachan's cousin regiment, the Krapatan Bug Fighters, because they weren't fighting no jungle, they were fighting the gosh darn Tyranids. So then the invasion finally kicked off with the Tyranids launching a bunch of bioships, only for them to get blasted by the lasers. After about an hour of constant lasing and bioshipping, the fleet fell back. With the bulk of the enemy fleet seemingly shredded by the planet's defenses, Mangos Veranak led a splinter fleet to pursue the retreating bioships and kill the rest of them. However, Veranak was very mistaken. He found out that the ships that the lasers had destroyed were a mere fraction of the actual fleet. The fleet that he initially thought to be made up of a few dozen bioships was actually made up of thousands of bioships. Turns out the Tyranid scouting force did a little Tom and Jerry maneuver to lure the Imperial pursuit fleet to their much bigger and badder buddies, and once meeting the bulk of the Tyranid fleet, the Imperials were swiftly destroyed and the Tyranids launched their full assault on Tyran. The Nid fleet shot thousands of mycetic spores, which are basically Tyranid drop pods, onto the oceans around the Imperial fortress, and millions of Nids closed in on the island. The Imperials fought hard and unleashed unending volleys of blast fire, but unfortunately for them, the Tyranids were even more unending and were getting ever closer to breaking the Imperial fortress's defenses. Even worse for the Imperials, the Tyranids had something called the Shadow and the Warp. This is an ability that Tyranids have to block psychic connections to surrounding beings. This can even affect regular people, as almost everybody has a warp signature, so it usually gives most people at least feelings of uneasiness. As if seeing a million knife-wielding dinosaur bugs didn't already make you feel uneasy. But even more important than making the Imperials poop their pants is that the Shadow of the War prevented the planet's astropaths from calling in reinforcements, so the dwindling guard force was all there would ever be to defend the planet. Said dwindling guard force dwindled even more when the orbital defenses were overrun and even more mycetic spores dropped planetside. Soon after, the Tyranids completely overtook the fortress and killed everyone. After killing all the Imperials, the Tyranids completely consumed all of the biomass on Tyran and sucked the oceans completely dry, proving that the Tyranids still use Snapchats as they're the thirstiest motherfuckers on the block. About a year later, Inquisitor Cryptman, yes, the same one who would go on to make the ill-fated Octarius Gambit, would come across a dead world and find a message left by Vagos Veranak talking about how hopeless it is to fight the Tyranids and warning the greater Imperium of the existential threat that these funky bug dudes posed. Cryptman dubbed this new Xenos menace as the Tyranids, since, they're first ID'd on Tyran. Now, what should I call this new alien bugs? Well, I did ID them on the planet of Tyran. Tyran ID. Oh, I know. ID Tyrans. Oh, wait, no. Tyranids, yes! This particular Tyranid force was named High Fleet Behemoth, and it ravaged every planet in its way, leaving a wake of dead worlds. As the onslaught continued, Cryptman continued to study them, and he relayed his information to the Ultramarines chapter master, Marnius Calgar. Using Cryptman's research, Calgar and the forces of Ultramar fortified Macragge and prepared for a final stand in order to stop Behemoth dead in its deadly tracks. Macragge would serve as an important defensive position, as it was the Imperium's only real chance to stop the fleet. If Macragge fell, the planet's passive would not be reasonably equipped to stop such a threat, and the Ultima Sector, as well as the Imperium as a whole, would be in great danger. Calgar gathered every single spaceship he possibly could in order to create a defensive line across Macragge's orbit. In addition to the Void Forces, Calgar heavily reinforced Macragge's polar fortresses with Marines and the Ultramar Auxilia. And soon it would be on like Donkey Kong, brother, when the Tyranids kicked off the party. The Hive began by sending in suicidal waves of bioships that would make a Krieger blush through his mask. Even though the defensive line was destroying most of the incoming ships, some would trickle through and mycetic spores would make their way to the surface. On the planet's surface, Calgar led his ground forces. He divided his army into three groups. Two of the groups, which were primarily made up of veterans of the First Company, hunkered down and defended the two polar fortresses. The third group was personally led by Calgar and was made up of the entire Second Company, along with various other Ultramarine companies. This third and final force was the largest, and its purpose was to flank the Tyranids in order to aid the polar defenders. Although Calgar was a masterful tactician and had effective strategies, the Imperials were still losing ground to the Tyranids. Due to the heavy losses, Calgar was forced to fall back further north, which left an important starport to get overrun by Gene Stealers. This crippled Macragge's fleet and inflicted heavy losses on the Ultramar Auxilia. Higher up north, the Ultramarines met up with the large company of Auxilia and set up heavy fortifications at the Cold Steel Ridge Industrial Complex. The Auxilia force was formidable and even had possession of a Baneblade super heavy battle tank, which would be invaluable in the upcoming defense. But things were only going to get worse for the Blue Besties. It often gets overlooked since Tyranids are often perceived as mindless beasts, but the hive mind is actually a highly intelligent being, and its constantly adapting nature proved hard to overcome, even for the Ultramarines chapter master. The hive mind analyzed its prey and decided that Calgar was one of the most pressing threats in the war. To deal with Big Blue, it sent in a Swarmlord to kill him. Swarmlords are some of the deadliest Tyranid organisms, if not the deadliest. Swarmlords have the most autonomy of all the Tyranid units, and they specialize in strategizing. They're master tacticians, and they lead the lesser Tyranid organisms when simple tactics won't suffice. From this, you might think there's some kind of big brain nerd unit who only works out in the library, but Swarmlords are no slouches in a fight. They're most commonly equipped with their deadly boners, I mean bone sabers, and they can cut through adamantium and force fields like they're butter. With their extreme speed and reflexes, they fight with relentless fury, and very few opponents can even land a hit on them. With their forearms, speed, and overwhelming fighting style, I like to imagine them as fleshy, buggy, ginormous versions of the 2003 Clone Wars General Grievous. If that doesn't show you how scary these guys are, either the Clone Wars 2008 series polluted your mind too much with Grievous being a lame-o escape artist, or I'm too old and no one cares about 2003 Clone Wars anymore. Additionally, if they do happen to get killed, which actually happens a lot as they're one of the setting's favorite punching bags, they can be reborn from the hive mind with all their memories and experiences intact. This allows the hive mind to spawn deadly swarmlords with centuries of experience and knowledge. But anyways, back to the battle. Now that the Tyranids had a big dude to strategize for them, things went south for the Marines who went north. One of the first strategies implemented by the Swarm Lord was sending in Raveners to burrow underground and flank the Marines. The Marines responded to the sudden assault, but they foolishly overextended, leaving their Baneblade unsupported. While the Imperials focused down on the Raveners, Carnifexes tore the unsupported Baneblade to shreds. Seeing that the Tyranids were using actual tactics that weren't just, more bug than bullet, durr. That made Calgar shit in his ultra toilet, and he realized that things were no longer a circus, they were for serious. Two master strategists went head to head. Calgar and the Swarmlord had a battle of the brains as they both played 40k chess with each other, and this battle of the brains eventually culminated in a battle of the brawn when Calgar decided to fall back once more. But the Swarmlord was having none of this retreat nonsense, and it and its tyrant guards rushed in to engage Calgar and his honor guards in an epic battle. Fist met blade, blade met blue, blue met red. It was a mixer, and the only guests were these hands. The wounded Calgar put up a good fight, but was eventually overwhelmed by the vicious Swarmlord. As the Swarmlord prepared its killing blow, Calgar's honor guard shielded the chapter master and sacrificed themselves to evacuate their boss. Calgar and the Ultramarines boarded Thunderhawk gunships and they once again fell back. Or should I say they fell up because they went to the orbital battle barge of Octavius. Without Calgar, the Cold Steel Ridge was lost to the Tyranids. That was the last line of defense before the North Pole Fortress and the remaining Marines and Santa Claus prepared their two final strongholds at the poles. In orbit, Calgar recovered and assumed control of the remainder of the Imperial fleet. The Tyranid fleet fell back, attempting to get Calgar away from Macragge and lure him into a trap. But Calgar had also planned a trap. Both sides had a trap laid on the nearby ringed planet of Circe. Just like in those boomerangs, there was something deadly hiding behind the rings. A Tyranid fleet emerged from the planet's rings to destroy Calgar's fleet. However, the Blue Boss pulled an Uno reverse card and his reinforcing Tempestus fleet arrived just in time to pincer the Tyranid forces. Of the fleet was the ancient and formidable Emperor-class battleship Dominus Astra. The Emperor-class battleships are some of the largest Imperial starships ever made and are ancient war machines. These ships are invaluable due to their firepower, size, and the fact that the Imperium doesn't know how to make them anymore, so they are a finite asset. Even with the Tempestus fleet, Calgar's forces were woefully outnumbered. Though the Imperial Navy fought valiantly, it seemed like they would be once again outmatched. That is, until the Dominus Astra came in with the steel chair. The massive battleship flew straight into the center of the Tyranid fleet, and it overloaded its warp drives. This caused a massive warp vortex that transported nearly the entire Tyranid force into the warp, along with the ancient battleship. Which, come to think about, is kind of like a mini version of what Abaddon did on Cadia. But since I like the Imperium, I'm just going to frame this as a heroic sacrifice and not a whiny, if I can't have it, nobody can moment. Like, get wrecked, heretic scum, am I right, boys? Even though the fleet was destroyed, the behemoth forces on Macragge still posed a massive threat. Captain Saul Invictus of the First Company led the defenses in Calgar's absence, and the First Company, along with the Titan legions, defended the northern ice fields. Both the South and North defense forces were faltering and likely would have been overwhelmed if not for Calgar's army returning just in time. In the South, there were few survivors, but with the help of a free blade and the reinforcing Ultramarines, they purged the remaining Tyranids in the underground tunnels of the fortress. Up in the north, things were a bit more dire, but with the combined might of Thunderhawk ordnance, Devastator squads, and some dreadnoughts, the Ultramarines assaulted the undergrounds just like their brothers did in the South Pole. After much fighting, they got to the final room of the fortress where they found thousands of Tyranids dead at the feet of the final Terminator squad of the First Company. These Terminators brought down a small army before perishing. The entirety of the Ultramarines' First Company had sacrificed themselves defending their home planet. Despite massive losses, the Ultramarines had successfully defended their home and halted Behemoth's warpath. In the following years, the Imperials worked hard to kill all of the remaining Tyranids. They were aided by the Blood Angels and Terminix in their extermination efforts. It took the Marines decades to return to full strength, but they had learned valuable lessons about the galaxy's newest threat. From the ashes of the chapter, Chaplain Cassius assembled an elite unit of Ultramarines dubbed the Tyrannic War Veterans. These Marines experienced the bug baddies firsthand, and they trained in tactics to combat them. They regularly battle hive fleets, and they aid their Imperial brethren across the galaxy. As for the Tyranids, although High Fleet Behemoth was seemingly annihilated, the Swarmlord's body was never found, and the Behemoth forces scattered in order to gather biomass and regrow their numbers. These splinter fleets were encountered on nearby worlds and continued to be significant threats. One notable attack was led by one of the few named Tyranids, Old One-Eye. The aptly named One-Eye Carnifex was sighted assaulting the world of Kalth. Although on paper this was an Imperial victory, I wouldn't really say it was a Tyranid loss. They may have lost the Battle of Macragge, but before that happened, they completely killed many Imperial worlds, severely crippled the Ultramarines, and they gained valuable knowledge on the Imperium. Like previously stated, the hive mind is constantly adapting and creating strategies to counter its opponent. So this war strengthened the hive mind more than it damaged it. But that's all I've got for today. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. The Tyranids are an awesome faction and they pose a major threat to the 40k universe. Also, the Ultramarines, they're usually hated on, but I'm just gonna say it. The Ultramarines are cool, gosh darn it. Roman-themed super soldiers are super cool. Like, just look at these dudes and tell me they aren't some of the coolest things you've ever done seen. Also, aesthetically, I love how the colors of the Ultramarines look fighting against the colors of Behemoth in art. The blue and the red, ooh, it's just so nice. Also, the channel recently hit 40k. I have now collected the 40,000 Warhammers and I can begin my ascension to a true 40k YouTuber. Thank you everyone for supporting the channel. It has been tremendous. And thank you to the Patreons who support the channel a bit more. I appreciate all of you even more than GW appreciates the Ultramarines. As always, please like, comment, subscribe, and consider sharing to all your blue and red Space Marines and slash or dinosaur bug monster things. Thanks. I could probably go on an hour-long rant about how good Behemoth looks against the Ultramarines. Like, Leviathan is cool and all, but they just don't pop against the Blueberries quite enough for me. What's cracking, everyone? Well, Kraken is cracking. So let me, Crack, get to cracking about Kraken. That's right, today we're going to talk about Tyrannic War 2 Electric Boogaloo. Also, I wrote this segment before I realized children use crack as slang for sex. Oh, God. So, anyways, after the First Tyrannic War, when the Ultramarines narrowly defeated the apocalyptic Behemoth force, the Tyranid threat was generally thought to be destroyed. After the bulk of the fleet was destroyed on McCrag, only small Behemoth splinters remained to attack minor Imperial worlds, and even less importantly, attack Xenos worlds. So, like many Xenos before them, the Imperium just put them in the been there, genocided that pile, and mostly disregarded them. But that would be foolish, for Kraken was on the horizon. Unlike Hive Behemoth before them, who attacked in a singular full-scale assault, Hive Kraken would attack with many simultaneous, small, but coordinated assaults across the front thousands of light years wide. This fragmented assault would have a number of benefits for them. Firstly, since the Hive fleet was spread out, the Tyranid shadow in the warp was much larger and whole systems would be cut off. Additionally, Kraken would attack, skip, and isolate planets in unpredictable patterns. This seeming randomness made it really hard for Imperials to defend since they couldn't accurately predict where the next attack might be. Often they'd fortify a whole world just for Kraken to ignore it. So, because of this, the Imperials were forced to withdraw forces from many lesser worlds in order to defend the most important worlds like Forge worlds, Agri worlds, and the most populous Hive worlds. And in this time, many worlds were sacrificed, and the Imperial defenders took grievous losses. Some highlights were the battle for the Miral system, where, at the Giant's Coffin, the size of the Emperor took a heroic last stand against Kraken, with only 100 of them escaping the planet. And then, in Devlin, where the legendary Red Terror terrorized the world, and a company of Lamenters sacrificed themselves to hold the line as civilians evacuated. Typical base Lamenters moment. But after many worlds were devoured, Kraken finally began to converge on some key war zones. Of these were Ikar 4 and, much more interestingly, Craftworld Eandon. On Ikar 4, long before Kraken fully revealed itself and launched the Tyrannic War, there was a religious uprising by a cult known as the Brotherhood. They promised the Emperor's return and salvation for all. But what they actually meant to say was the Hive's arrival and salivation for all bugs. Which worshipping bugs would be weird and all, unless, of course, gene stealer cults. So, yeah, the Arbites, Imperial Guard, and Space Marines fought the Gene Stealers, and a Terminator strike team boldly fought through the underground labyrinth of the Hive and killed the Patriarch. This was great at the moment, but it would send a powerful psychic wave that seemingly beckoned Kraken towards the planet. And so, later on, Kraken's various splinter fleets would converge upon Ikar once more to finish what the Genestealers started. They launched a massive assault with nearly all of their bugs. To start the party, Genestealer remnants that secretly festered launched a huge ambush from below. This scattered the defenders as Kraken sent waves of evil-ass bugs. And this time around, the Nids brought out the big guns. And by big guns, I mean big bugs. Big bugs with guns. That also happened to be big. And initially, the Imperials took huge losses despite their fortified position, but then, the greatest heroes of all time, the Ultramarines arrived! Woo! Jokes aside, though, the Ultramarines' arrival was probably the best thing that could happen for the Imperials, since at that point, the Ultramarines were the best chapter at fighting Tyranids after their war with Behemoth. But anyways, Marnius Calgar of Calgar Blue fame and the Tyrannic War veterans gave crucial advice on how to fight the buggy menace. And with that, though, let's take a break from the Marines to swing over to the much more interesting war front, Craftworld Eandon. Craftworld Eandon was one of the most populous and powerful craft worlds. Big emphasis on the was, and we could thank Hive Kraken for putting that tragic little was in the prior sentence. Eandon had the misfortune of traveling around the path of Kraken, and by the time their rangers had spotted the Tyranids, Eandon was too far into Kraken's huge fleet path to retreat. So every Eandian I don't think that was the right way to say that, was forced to take up arms and prepare to defend their home. In addition, the Rangers and Farseer's reports were so dire that Farseer Kelman begrudgingly ordered the spirits of Eandon's Infinity Circuit to be taken to serve as the Eldar's Ghost Warriors. Despite being badass, even among the elves, Grave Robin Grandma Soul to draft her against your bug problem is generally frowned upon. But you gotta do what you gotta do, and sometimes you gotta raise the dead to make sure the amount of dead doesn't rise. And so, when Kraken finally arrived, Eandon's fleets engaged them in a void war. Initially, they found success taking down many hive ships, but they were hopelessly outnumbered, and Kraken was eventually able to break through and make planetfall. Or, I guess, ship that's basically a mini planetfall. And on Craftworld Eandon, things got a little bit nutty. In the artificial atmosphere, swooping hawks and falcons dueled harpies, and in the ancient Wraithbone halls, striking scorpions engaged endless hordes in brutal melees, dire avengers scythed down nids, and wraith knights wrestled foul carnifexes. There were even badass kaiju mech fights as Wraith Knights battled Tyrannid Biotitans. It was all out war in the craft world, and despite fighting well, the Eldar's numbers were dwindling against the endless waves of bugs. Eventually, it got to the point that the Wraith constructs actually outnumbered the true living Eldar. But at the brink of extinction, when all hope seemed lost, the exiled coolest dude ever, Prince Uriel of Uriel Yellow fame, made his return. Although he swore to never return, Uriel couldn't just let his people get annihilated. So he brought his pirate fleet, the Eldritch Raiders, to save his home. Uriel's Corsair fleet pincered the Kraken forces and engaged in another void battle to take pressure off of the Craftworlders. Being a pirate lord, Uriel was an excellent admiral, and the Corsairs took down two huge Kraken waves. In the void, Uriel's forces hunted down the largest bioships, and despite taking heavy losses, they had eventually defeated the Void Fleet. With its fleet disabled, the remaining Kraken forces launched a suicidal final assault headed by the Hive Tyrant. This final wave was nearly unstoppable. Nothing could slow the tyrant. Even the mighty Wraith Lords and Wraith Knights were scythed down by the foul beast. So the Eldar rose the Avatar of Cain to match the mighty beast. The Avatar of Cain challenged the Hive Tyrant to an honor duel. But, silly Cain, bugs have no honor, only hunger. So the Hive Tyrant simply Carnifex spammed the Avatar and went on with his day. So, as a dozen or so Carnifexes tore the Avatar to shreds, the Tyrant wreaked havoc elsewhere. And so, when hope seemed lost for the infinitieth time, Prince Uriel once again arrived to save the day. His Corsairs arrived on the craft world to help their fellow elves. And at the critical moment, Prince Uriel sacrificed his soul to take upon the cursed Spear of Twilight. The spear had immense power, but it would permabond with its user and sap their soul energy over time. But with his badass cursed weapon, Prince Uriel engaged the Hive Tyrant in glorious combat. He thrust the Spear of Twilight into the Tyrant's face and exterminated the beast. Badass. And although they won, it came at a great cost. Most of Eandon had been killed, and their craft world was all but destroyed. But, anyways, on the other front, things weren't too good either. Even with the Ultramarines, Kraken still destroyed much of Ikar. After about a year of endless battle, most of the Emperor's spears and lamenters had been killed, and the hives of the world were in flame. But eventually, the mighty Calgar would once again duel a Swarm Lord. This time, however, hardened by Behemoth, Calgar would have the skills needed to slay the beast. With the Swarm Lord slain, the remaining Kraken forces began to fall apart, and the Imperium was able to reclaim the scorched husk of their world. And although they won, it came at a great cost. Most of the Space Marines had been killed, and their Ikar 4 was all but destroyed. But with the two defenders triumphing, Kraken was defeated and was forced to splinter out to survive. And so, long before the return of Gilliman, the Ultramarines and Eldar had a technical alliance that saved their people from total annihilation. Both victories were absolutely critical in stopping Kraken, and if either had failed, it is said that Kraken would have become unstoppable. And honestly, Kraken's kind of stupid. They had a good strategy of fanning out, and then they switched it up to just do a big attack. but they didn't commit hard enough, so their two mini big attacks ended up just barely getting defeated. Like, damn, the hive mind could really benefit from playing a game or two of Risk. Then maybe they could learn to allocate their forces better. But I suppose they are named Kraken and not Thinkin' for a reason, so it's all good. Even with that, though, I still really like Kraken. I think of the main three hive fleets, they have the coolest name and color scheme, so that's a huge plus for me. But let me know what you think of Kraken, Eandon, and the Second Tyrannic War. Also, be sure to comment your favorite of the Tyrannic Wars. Personally, the second is my favorite simply because Eandon and Uriel are just so damn cool. It really is one of the best Eldar stories to me. Also, don't forget to check out Ironside Computers at my link below. Thanks. Also, the greatest piece of the Tyrannic War media is literally just any mini-sode episode with the Tyranids in it. His battle reports are so peak. Please go watch them. Hi friends, today we're going to talk about one of the worst, if not the worst things that happened to the good old Blood Angels since their glorious dad Sanguinius got pulped by known jerk Mr. Horus Heresy. So, find your favorite red shirt, do a little cry about your lost dad, grab a can of Raid, and let's get ready to learn all about the devastation of Baal. The devastation of Baal was a desperate last stand by the Imperial forces to protect the world of Baal against the Tyranid menace. The clash was the ultimate conclusion to the Third Tyrannic War and was a pivotal moment in the history of the Blood Angels. Anyways though, Baal is the wasteland homeworld of the Blood Angels, and Devastation is one of the best, if not the best, Transformers games. Oops, wait, no, I mean Devastation is what those goofy little critters the Tyranids plan to carry out on Baal so that they could continue their warpath throughout the galaxy and consume that sweet, sweet biomass. And the devastation of Baal began off of Baal on its sister system of Kryptis. The Kryptis system was known as the Krypton Shield and was important to the Blood Angels since it was the first line of defense for the world of Baal. The Krypton Shield was attacked by the infamous Hive Fleet Leviathan on their never-ending quest to satiate the Great Devourer's never-ending hunger. Across the Krypton Shield, the combined Imperial forces of the Blood Angels, Flesh Terrors, Sisters of Battle, Imperial Guard, and other dudes fought back the gargantuan hordes of Tyranids. On the first day, the Imperium successfully killed millions of Tyranids thanks to strategies learned in prior Tyrannic wars, cunning leadership, and savage heroics. However, killing millions of Tyranids means little when there's like a bazillion of them. And these early victories meant little for the Imperials as Leviathan simply adapted to the Imperial tactics and unleashed their hive in full force. This second wave was devastating, and in a mere day, nearly all of the shield worlds of Kryptis were decimated as the unending swarms utterly crushed the Imperial defenders. The remaining Imperials fell back and were reinforced by Ultra Mega Chad, Louis Dante, and his Blood Angels. Dante and his boys secured some minor victories, but it was clear that these efforts were futile. Meanwhile, on another world in the Kryptis system, Asphodex, the Mithrid dynasty was awoken by Anrakir the Traveler. These Necrons formed a temporary alliance with the Blood Angel to repel the Tyranids and activate an ancient Necron tier weapon, the Star Flame. Through their combined efforts, the Necrons and the Imperials activated the weapon, and with a heavy heart, Dante decided to make a huge sacrifice to defend the greater Imperium. He knew that the Hive would only continue to grow as it consumed the biomass of the Imperial defenders, and it would soon be unstoppable. So, he used the Star Flame to destroy one of Kryptis' twin stars, and then he used it to further devastate the Tyranid forces along with his own when he shot the Star Flame across the system, destroying everything in its wake. This severely crippled Leviathan and bought the Blood Angels and other Imperials the time they needed to evacuate survivors and fortify Baal for the Leviathan counterattack. And, unfortunately for the Marines, they'd be mostly alone in their defense as most of the Guard and Sisters were killed in the Kryptis campaign or sent off to reinforce Cadia since a little thing called the 13th Black Crusade was also happening at this time. So then, Dante prepared his chapter and remaining forces as he called upon all of the sons of Sanguinius to return to their homeworld to stage their epic defense. And so, shortly before the Tyranids launched their invasion, over 25 successor chapters joined the Blood Angel forces, even including some renegade chapters like the Knights of Blood. Notably, the Lamenters did not show up, which is honestly probably for the best as their cosmic bad luck probably wouldn't have helped in this apocalyptic battle. Anyways, this congregation of Blood Angel successors was the largest family reunion for the Sons of Sanguinius since the heresy, and with their combined might, Dante had command of nearly 30,000 Marines. Many Marines gathered to coordinate their defense in the city of Angel's Fall, which is where Sanguinius first landed as a little baby Primarch. The Marines would be split into 4 forces to defend their home. You see, Ball itself has 2 balls. It's Moons, Ball Primus, and Ball Secundus. And so, about a fifth of the Marines, notably including the Flesh Terrors, were sent to Ball Primus, a fifth to Ball Secundus, and a fifth to stage an orbital offense, and then the rest to the planet of Ball. On Ball and its balls, the Marines fortified their fortress monastery, void shield generators, gun batteries, and other significant structures. They also used some of Ball's natural hazards to fortify, one notable one being a mote of the deadly creature known as Thirstwater. This is an ambush predator that looks like water and kills whatever comes into contact with it, which is pretty badass. Anyways though, Leviathan would arrive at Ball seeking vengeance and a tasty snack after the events in Cryptus, and they launched their assault. The Battle of Ball started with a huge orbital clash of hundreds of ships on both sides fighting it out in Ball's orbit. And by hundreds of ships on both sides, I actually mean the Marines had hundreds of ships and the Nits had tens and thousands of ships. Despite being greatly outnumbered, the Marines put up a valiant fight and used nuclear missiles to level the playing field a bit. But despite the Marines' great efforts, the Tyranid Horde was able to outmaneuver the Marines and unveiled a secret second fleet that ambushed and crushed the remains of the Marines' orbital defenses. And even after taking heavy losses, the Tyranids still had a huge number of bugs to unleash on the planet. So, with the orbital defenses mangled, Leviathan made planetfall and moonfall. Wait, the bugs made moonfall? Absolute cinema! But anyways, the Tyranids began their assault with a tried and true tactic of sending endless waves of endless bugs at the enemies. This strategy proved effective as the Marines were already vastly outnumbered. And just like in the Void, the Tyranids would rapidly adapt to any strategy the Marines could muster. And to make matters even worse, a warp rift was opening in the system, and the Angels had to send an elite team of librarians to mend it. This meant that, beyond the looming threat of chaos joining the fray, the Blood Angels didn't have access to their most powerful character, the ultra mega super insano madman Lord of Death Mephiston. And so, since he was busy trying to mend a warp rift with some other librarians, he didn't get to do much bug hunting other than single-handedly annihilating a giant swarm of Tyranids crazy style on the way to the rift. But anyways, on all fronts the Angels were being battered down and losing Marines at an unacceptable rate. Great heroes of countless battles were being cut down by the savage claws of Leviathan. The Hive Mind had also sent Gene Stealers, Lictors, and Raveners behind Blood Angel lines in order to completely surround the hopeless defenders. They erupted from within the Angels' fortresses and destroyed all they came across. Notably, the Blood Angel neophytes and their sarcophagi were being targeted, which would destroy the Blood Angel's hopes of rebuilding and continuing as a chapter. So, Dante got on his bike and continued to show why he's the coolest Blood Angel maybe ever as he tore through the halls of the Arx Angelicum on an assault bike, cutting and blasting bugs so badassly it would make a White Scar blush. But this was a trap. The Tyranid Gambit to divert Dante away from the main defense had worked, and a Lictor was able to destroy the shield generator, and Dante failed to protect the Angel sarcophagi, dooming the Blood Angel's future. This was a decisive move as the Angels were now besieged by artillery fire and aerial forces, making the swarm even more deadly. Meanwhile, on Ball Secundus, the Swarm Lord had finally appeared and started wreaking havoc on the Imperial defenders, turning the tide of the battle on Secundus. And, if things weren't bad enough, back with Team Mephiston, one of his Psykers fell to the temptation of Khorne, and the ritual had failed, opening the gate for a demonic incursion on Ball Primus. Gulp. And then, if things weren't bad enough, across the galaxy, Cadia had fallen. R.I.P. This fall meant that the Great Rift tore through the galaxy, and this psychic cataclysm fully opened the gate on Ball Primus, allowing the ancient nemesis of the Blood Angels, Kabunda, to manifest. Hell literally broke loose as the demons attacked both the Tyranids and the Imperials. But Luckily for the Space Marines, the huge warp surge temporarily dazed the Tyranid forces, cutting them off from the hive mind for a little bit. In the din of the battle, the Knights of Blood sacrificed themselves so that the Flesh Tearers could fall back to Baal and make their last stand. The Knights Mega Chad Chapter Master Centaur Jewel let himself go to the Black Rage and he tried to solo Kabunda. He of course instantly lost, but it was cool nonetheless. With their sacrifice, the Knights of Blood were redeemed, and Gabriel and the boys were able to escape the planet as the demons killed literally everything on Baal Primus. But luckily, as a consolation prize, the opening of the Great Rift and the arrival of Kabunda did wipe out a large chunk of the Tyranid fleet and gave Dante time to give an awesome speech and inspire his Marines for their final stand. Dante declared all Blood Angels to be Death Company as they were now a doomed chapter about to kill as many Tyranids as they could before their inevitable deaths. The gates of the Tower of Omero were opened again, and those lost to the Black Rage fought alongside their brothers one last time. In this final stand, things went real crazy style as the Blood Angels and Tyranids made a final clash. Dante and his brothers began to fall to the Black Rage and fought more ferociously than ever. The Sanguinor also appeared leading the Legion of the Damned against the Great Devourer, and he guided Dante towards the Swarmlord for an epic final duel. Before fighting the beast, Dante looked into the Swarmlord's eyes and gazed into the vastness of the hive mind and its infinite hunger. For a moment, Dante sympathized with the beast as the red thirst paled in comparison to the Great Devourer's great hunger. And so, before their vicious battle, Dante began to fall to the Black Rage and he saw the beast as Horus, but he warded off the madness and declared that he will die as Dante, not Sanguinius. And at last, Dante and the Swarmlord engaged in their final duel. They traded blows for a while, and eventually Dante's jump pack was destroyed, leaving his armor with limited power. He was then assailed by a psychic attack from the Swarmlord, but he was unwavered, and he shattered the monster's blade. And with his armor failing, Dante lined up a final shot with his Inferno pistol, and fired a shot so intense that it scorched himself and completely vaporized the Swarmlord's vile face. With the Swarmlord dead, Dante collapsed to the floor and accepted his long-awaited death. But then, the Sanguinor appeared, and through the apparition, Sanguinius himself spoke to Dante once more. Dante begged his father to let him finally die, but Sanguinius lamented the fact that Dante's story was not yet over, and he still had purpose. Dante was then revived, and he awoke to the newly resurrected Primarch Robude Guilliman. Guilliman and his indomitable Primaris had saved the remnants of the Blood Angels and helped reclaim Baal from the Tyranids and Chaos Menace. In addition, the Primaris reinforcements would allow the Blood Angels to live on despite the grievous losses they faced. And due to Dante's heroics, Guilliman officially appointed him Regent of the Imperium Nihilus, ushering in a new age of hope for the chapter. Although they were ravaged to just a few hundred Marines, and many of their successor chapters were completely wiped out, they were now able to rebuild with the new Primaris project. And so, Dante and his angels worked towards hunting down the remains of Leviathan and destroying the chaos taint brought on by Kabunda. As for the Tyranids, despite being nearly wiped out by the Marines and Demon forces, Leviathan managed to slip away and regroup. It used the valuable knowledge gained against the Blood Angels to launch the Fourth Tyrannic War after regaining their vast numbers. For the Tyranids' great hunger can never be destroyed. And yeah, that's the devastation of Baal, and the conclusion of the Third Tyrannic War. If you thought that this story was cool, I'd strongly urge you to read the Devastation of Baal novel. I think it's a cool Blood Angels book with a lot of badass moments, especially from Dante, but both sides get cool moments. I intentionally left some things out as to not spoil the entire book, just the major plot points, but it's still a good read. And I think that the Blood Angels and Tyranids are such a natural fit for enemies considering their fighting style and themes, and the parallels between the two are also quite interesting, making for a pretty cool story. But let me know what you thought of this battle and what battles you'd like me to cover next in the comments below. The Devastation of Baal novel literally starts with a grumpy old man taking a pee-pee, which is kinda peak. Hi friends, today we're going to talk about one of the biggest defeats the Imperium has ever faced and one of its most tragic losses. Today we're going to be talking about the Fall Acadia. The Fall Acadia was a critical attack on one of the most important Imperial worlds and has had huge impacts on the greater universe. But what led to this defeat? Why is it so important? Who is Cadia and why are they so clumsy? We'll answer all those questions and more in today's video. Let's get started. So for context, Cadia was one of the most important fortress worlds in the whole Imperium. It was extremely important due to its proximity to the Eye of Terror. Cadia was on the only passable route in or out of the Eye of Terror. Because of this, Cadia became a crucial line of defense in an area known as the Cadian Gate. This gate kept the forces of chaos at bay and prevented a catastrophic invasion. Another significant feature of Cadia were the Cadian pylons. These pylons were large black stone obelisks that were made by the Necrons to weaken psychic energies during the War of Heaven. Luckily for the Cadians, the Necrons were kind of litter bugs and they just left their anti-magic pylons all over the place. And the pylons' anti-magic properties conveniently held the Eye of Terror warp energies back and kept the area manageable. Due to the strategic importance of Cadia, it has long been a target of attack from the forces of chaos. And at first, the Cadians were ill-equipped to handle the constant assaults, so they had to reform their world and culture. Cadians reformed their society and culture in order to better prepare to deal with the constant barrage of chaos forces knocking on their door asking if they'd like to hear a word about their Lord and Savior, four-way Satan. One such reform is that their society became heavily militarized, even by 40k standards. About 72% of their population is under arms, which is almost as much as Texas. The Cadian children are taught to strip, assemble, and shoot firearms before learning to read, also like Texas. Even the civilian aspects of Cadia are militarized. All the houses are heavily armored, everyone is trained to fight, social classes are dependent on military rank. The normal civilian clothes are even camouflage and military-esque, which again, is much like Texas, but this prevalent military culture is very important because it helps make Cadians some of the best warriors in the galaxy. And in addition to societal reforms, Cadians have also reformed the way they built their cities. In the center of each city, there's a mighty fortress called a Khazar. And yes, this is where the Khazar can come from.
Yes! Khazar #1!
And each Khazar was extremely well defended and designed to hold out against invaders for a very long time. Generally, a Khazar had a void shield, and then a perimeter with many gun emplacements, and then a moat, and then a hefty wall and fortified gate, and then past that, you're finally in the city streets of the Khazar. But wait right there, would-be invaders, the defenses aren't done yet. Once you finally make it inside the Khazars, there's even more defensive measures. On top of the usual stuff like gun emplacements and planetary defense troops, the Khazar streets are intentionally designed to be confusing to invaders. The city layout is made in complex geometric patterns, which means the Cadians basically live in the little puzzles you get at the Applebee's Kids menus. But the puzzling layout isn't just because the city planners were too busy killing demons and being the best regiment around. It was actually intentionally done to give Cadians an extra advantage in defenses. The Cadians excel in urban combat, so the confusing layout and heavily defended buildings help them hold out Khazars for far longer than a normal city. And these staunch defenses, they might seem like overkill, and if you think that, number one, you clearly aren't familiar with Warhammer because Overkill is its middle name, and two, you clearly weren't paying attention earlier because you must have forgotten that Cadians live on the border of literal actual hell. And these insane defenses to military culture, along with the Cadian pylons, were extremely important because it allowed the Cadians to reject Abaddon's advances for the 12 days of Christmas, 12 Black Crusades. And on the 12th day of God Emperormas, my true foe sent to me 12 Black Crusades, 11 Black Crusades, 10 Black Crusades. Yeah, that's right, the War Master of Chaos, commander of the forces of evil and all things nasty. It took him 13 tries to take over one planet.
Yes, first try!
And I know that in lore, each crusade weakened the Imperial forces and technically accomplished one step of Abby's grand plan. But still, the alpha male influencers on YouTube would tell me that there's only like 5 steps to becoming a successful millionaire overnight. So surely the Master of Chaos can condense it just a little bit. But now, let's talk about the 13th Black Crusade and finally get into the fall of Cadia. After 12 crusades, Abaddon finally took off his sweatshirt and declared, "This is no longer a circus, this is for serious." And the 13th Black Crusade kicked off when a bunch of space hulks started showing up across the Cadian sector, along with a bunch of Chaos battleships. And leading this vanguard assault was Typhus of the Death Guard. Typhus's plague fleet was causing terror across the sector, and this caused radical cults to form. These cults declared that the Chaos attacks were actually the Emperor punishing them for their sins, and the newfound cults were creating unrest, which led to many rebels against the Imperium. And this political unrest also allowed a preacher to rise in prominence as he proclaimed himself the voice of the Emperor, which further turned once loyal Imperials traitor. Across the sector, there are Chaos forces attacking Imperial worlds, and along with the rebellions, things were looking dire for the Imperial forces. However, despite all this, the planet Acadia remained steadfast against the assaults, and the pylons and Cadian shock troopers were going Insano style, holding back the forces of the warp. However, due to worsening conditions, the Cadian High Command ordered all Cadian regiments to reconvene on their home world. One of the returning regiments was the Volscani Cataphracts. The Cataphracts were revered across the sector as they were made up of many hardened veterans and had many accolades. In order to show their gratitude for the Cataphracts' return, Cadian leadership prepared a welcome party so they could meet them in person. However, the Cataphracts did a little bit of trolling on arrival, and they switched teams, spawn-killing the majority of Cadian High Command before the real battle could even begin. All would have been lost if not for the absolute Chad that is Lord Castellan Ursarkar Creed. Creed commanded a masterful counterattack that pushed back the traitors and allowed the Loyalists to regroup their defenses. And due to these heroics, Creed would be promoted to Governor of Cadia, and he would prove massively important in the upcoming war. Creed prepared the defenses, called for Space Marine reinforcements, and sent Kazarkin teams directly into the Eye of Terror in hopes of getting some intel on the upcoming assaults. On the other side of the war, Abaddon and the Chaos Heralds were making big strides. Typhus and Lucius were wreaking havoc, and the Night Lords were doing raids across the sector. Abaddon himself managed to capture 2 Blackstone fortresses. Now this is really important because Blackstone fortresses were massive Eldar warships made in ancient times as a failsafe against the Catan reawakening. As such, these planets were near planet-sized megaweapons that, when fully activated, could break the barrier between the warp and real space by shooting a beam that would make the Death Star look like a Nerf gun. So Abaddon having 2 under his control would prove to be a major issue. And so finally, after all the pre-gaming, Abaddon finally launched his attack on Cadia proper. He opened with a humongoid orbital bombardment and sent, in technical terms, a buttload of Chaos Space Marines, Demons, and Titans to assault the planet. Aided by the Space Wolves though, the Cadians fought hard against the Legions. The Cadians held the forces of chaos in a deadly stalemate, which, again, goes to show just how badass the Guard Boys really are, and in orbit the Imperial Navy was also getting some dubs, as they managed to drive Abaddon's forces back into the Cadian. This naval victory broke the Chaos blockade and opened the way for reinforcements, including the entirety of the legendary Battle Fleet Gothic. However, the Imperials reallocating their defenses to Cadia allowed Chaos forces to attack other Imperial worlds. On these worlds, everyone's favorite little guy, Erebus, summoned warp storms and demons. As if the forces of hell weren't enough, things were made worse by the encroaching Tyranid and Orc forces joining in on the fray, along with rumors of a demon Primarch showing up. However, despite the overwhelming odds, Creed led a counter-assault along with the White Scars, and eventually more Space Marine chapters arrived, including the Blood Angels, the Dark Angels, Black Templars, and Imperial Fists. Since there were so many best-selling chapters and named Space Marines, it looked as though Abaddon's crusade would fail yet again. After many victories, the Imperial forces thought the worst was behind them, and they even made plans for victory parties. However, everyone knows it's unwise to emote before you secure the Vicroy, and unfortunately for Cadia, the worst was yet to come. Up in the skies, the space chat from earlier, Admiral Quarren, detected a large Chaos Armada led by the Blackstone Fortress, the Will of Eternity, that was commanded by Abaddon himself. The Imperial fleet was quickly destroyed, and the Chaos forces encroached on Cadia. Knowing something was awry, Creed tried to unify the Imperial forces into a more coherent army that could better repel the heretics. However, he was ultimately unsuccessful as the other Imperials all had their own agendas and remained somewhat disjointed. Not being able to pull from the anime power of friendship would prove to be a huge detriment to the Imperials in the upcoming battles. But it wasn't all doom and gloom, as there were still Imperial victories, and even more named characters showed up to help out. Belisarius Call, with the aid of the Harlequins, activated even more pylons, while Saint Celestine manifested on the raised battlefields and wrecked shit. Even the Necrons joined in, as Trajan the Infinite was impressed by the huge steel balls of the Cadian, since they reminded him of his own steel balls, when they weren't literal steel balls. So the Necrons, they secretly used death marks to aid the Cadians. While things were looking a bit up, Creed commanded a Space Marine force to assault the Will of Eternity directly, and the Marines were able to penetrate the fortress. However, they were unable to kill Abaddon. Planetside, the Chaos forces made their way to the critical Khazar Craft. These Chaos forces were making advances, but they were mostly held back by the Khazarkin, who were killing Space Marines at an impressive rate considering they're just regular humans. After much bloodshed, the Chaos Commander, Urk Rathos, ascended to demonhood and made it to the Nola Ray that was holding back further demonic incursion. However, Saint Celestine emerged to engage the Demon Prince in an epic duel and banished him. But before banishment, Earth Rakos was able to destroy the Nola Ray, which allowed Abaddon to finally shoot his Blackstone Fortress Kamehameha. Luckily for the Imperials, though, before Abaddon could activate his Rage Art, it was revealed that a large Space Wolf force remained hidden on the Blackstone Fortress, and they launched a massive counterattack within the ship itself. Then, to make things worse on Abby's big day, the Legion of the Damned Marines manifested, and they helped the Space Wolves destroy his Chaos forces. All would have been lost for the Chaos forces if not for Abaddon arriving in his massive plot armor and pushing back the Wolves and the Damned. However, once again, Abaddon's parade was rained on when he realized, "It's a trap!" And the Imperial Fist Fortress Monastery, the Phalanx, showed up to blow its load all over the Will of Eternity, disabling Abaddon's trump card. Abaddon teleported away like a little nerd, and the Imperials were once again able to regroup and prepare to counterattack. In their desperations, the Imperials officially allied with Trajan the Infinite, so Call and his new skeleton buddy plan to amplify the pylons in order to push back the chaotic forces. Unfortunately for them, while they were strategizing, Abaddon found their location, and he personally came planetside with his besties to put an end to the Imperials. Breaking through the defenses, he approached Creed and Jar and Kel.
Kel sacrificed himself to allow Creed to escape. And Kel's death was actually pretty badass, as he was shit-talking Abaddon until the very end, saying how he's a poo-poo loser guy who needs to use god weapons to kill mere humans and this and that. I will kill all of your friends. I will destroy your planet. Cadia will fall. You are a disgraced godsman. How can you hope to stop me and my armies? After killing the color sergeant, Abaddon made his way to Colin Trazyn. But before he could fight the science nerds, Creed came back for revenge with a bunch of Australians. And at the same time, Trazyn opened his Tesseracts to summon an army of his Pokemon. Trazyn's army was led by a Heresy-era named Ultramarine, so you know he was bringing the big guns. After getting his shit kicked in by the Australians, Kazarkin, Custodes, Space Marines, and Trazyn's living Funko Pops, Abaddon teleported away yet again after Celestine landed a decisive blow, and the Cadian pylons were about to be reactivated. Ugh, they keep on stopping me! How can I kill this stupid planet? Sir, excuse me, I have looked into the archives and I found a tactic that some villains pulled in the ancient time of September 11th. Yeah, so Abaddon basically used his Blackstone Fortress to pull a 9/11 on Cadia. He used his flagship to push the Blackstone Fortress into the planet, and the impact caused massive destruction, and the Imperial forces were forced to evacuate. The impact also destroyed many of the pylons, so the warp was able to fully envelop the doomed planet. Creed valiantly held the line with his personal regiment so that as many Cadians as possible could escape. Celestine was superpowered from all the warp energy and was wrecking shit per usual. And even the Eldar stepped in using the webway and helped some Imperials, including Call and Inquisitor Greyfax, escape the forces of the Black Legion. But in the end, Abaddon was finally successful and Cadia had tragically fallen. Now that Cadia was lost, the Eye of Terror was able to widen and it tore the galaxy asunder with the Great Rift. This divided the galaxy into the Imperium and the more shitty Imperium, the Imperium Nihilus. The 13th Black Crusade launched the Imperium into an age of darkness. But all was not lost for the Imperium. Shortly after the fall of Cadia, Call, Greyfax, Celestine, and Yvraine were able to resurrect Primarch Rubuti Guilliman. Guilliman authorized the Primaris and led the Indominus Crusades to reclaim a lot of lost territory, especially in the Imperium Nihilus. As for the Cadians, around 3 million escaped off-planet, and Creed was taken by Trazyn as a party favor. The 3 million Cadians, along with the Cadians who couldn't make it to their homeworld, began to repopulate on new worlds, and the Cadian culture remained strong. Additionally, since the Cadians were such a respected and efficient regiment, many other Guard regiments had already adopted much of their culture and tactics for themselves. Guardsmen across the galaxy used Cadian equipment and doctrines, so while their home may be lost, the culture would never truly die. In that way, it's true that the planet broke before the Guard did, and Cadia truly stands. And with that, that's the fall of Cadia. Thank you everyone who watched this video, I hope you all enjoyed it. The fall of Cadia was one of the most crucial and epic moments in 40k. I really enjoyed researching and making this video. And I'd also like to thank anyone who's recently subscribed. I didn't think we would hit 100 so quickly, let alone 300, so I can't express my gratitude enough, and I really hope this channel continues to grow, because I really love making these silly little videos. And as always, if you like this video, please like, comment, subscribe, and consider sharing it. Thank you very much.
Hi friends, today we're talking about one of the biggest, if not the biggest, crusade since the Great Crusade. This was a humongo crusade that rallied the many forces of the Imperium, reintroduced the idea of organization back to humanity, and was headed by the instant money button that is Robude Guilliman. We're talking about the Indominus Crusade. After the tragic fall of Cadia, the forces of the Imperium were sent reeling at the destruction brought on by Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade. But they told Mr. War Master of Chaos, "Oh, so you like 13 so much, little guy? Well, fuck you, 13th Primarch, bitch!" And with the help of the Ynnari, rest in peace, this wacky party resurrected Robude Guilliman from stasis and interred him in the armor of fate. And with one of the Emperor's sons back alive and kicking, the Imperium's darkest hour now had a wee little Primarch-shaped light to ease the pain of losing the Imperium's second most important planet, the galaxy getting torn in half, and evil-ass demons everywhere. And upon waking up, Guilliman would immediately get to ass-kicking, utterly annihilating the Black Legion forces that tried to prevent his resurrection, and then he set off for Terra in order to reunite with his father and figure out just what the heck to do with the disgraceful state of the Imperium. And so, after a series of fights, most notably against his brother Magnus, Gilliman made it to Terra and spoke to the Emperor. Although it's not outright stated what exactly was said in this conversation, Gilliman left the throne room and declared himself the Lord Commander of the Imperium as well as Imperial Regent. As Lord Commander, Gilliman would defend against a huge second siege at Terra and then began work on weeding out the corrupt leaders of the Imperium and planning on how to recover from the losses in the 13th Black Crusade. He replaced corrupt High Lords with ones that more closely aligned with his vision for the Imperium, and he began to prepare for the Indomitus Crusade. Gilliman would put out a call for all Imperial forces across the galaxy to convene on Terra if they were able to. He even called for any chapter, regiment, or whatever other Imperial unit of soldiers there were to abandon war zones that they were likely to lose, since it would both avoid unnecessary casualties and they could reclaim it later with the larger and more organized Indomitus force. And like most things that Gilliman did at this time, it was pretty controversial for a Primarch to lead a great crusade of all the Imperial's forces. Last time this happened, like, I don't know, 10,000 years ago, a little heresy happened, and then some guy segmented all the forces of the Imperium to prevent such a thing from happening again. And that guy was named, Robude Gilliman. But regardless, Gilliman's the main character, and also the Emperor maybe told him to do so he could do whatever he wants. So he gathered a humongo force composed of guardsmen, space marines, sisters of battle, custodies, and basically any other Imperial capable of shooting and slash or... Oh, you know what? Actually, I guess and slash works. Gilliman would organize his huge force into 10 giant battle fleets, which are further split into battle groups, those being further divided into task forces, and then so on and so on. The primary purpose of this crusade was essentially to spread across the galaxy, reclaim Imperial worlds as fast as possible to re-establish dominance over Imperium Sanctus, so it was important that the crusade force was segmented in order for it to divide and conquer. Additionally, as the crusade went on, the fleet was meant to reinforce Imperial forces already fighting on worlds that they encountered, and after liberating a planet, they would requisition some supplies from the reclaimed planet in order to keep their momentum. However, the crusade also had the secondary purpose of delivering Gilliman's new Primaris Space Marines to the chapters who were unable to return to Terra. Their initial crusade force largely consisted of Primaris Grey Shields, also known as the Unnumbered Sons. These were Primaris Marines clad in grey, waiting to reunite with their parent chapters. Thus, a notable detachment would be the Torchbearer groups. These were specialized groups of Custodes, Sisters of Silence, and Mago Spyology who were accompanying the fleets so that they could introduce the new Primaris Marines and teach chapters how to make more going forth. And this force org not only tickled Gilliman's logistics autism, but it was also designed to allow the giant fleet to systematically move across the galaxy and reclaim worlds all around, rather than just having a big dum-dum mob rambling about. Each fleet would be led by a fleet master who would coordinate their own mini crusades, sending each of their battle groups on their own campaigns. The battle groups were all totally self-sufficient, and beyond major orders and an occasional strategic council, they would work completely autonomously from their fleet. This stratified force would allow the Indomitus Crusade to cover huge chunks of the galaxy and claim worlds at a quicker rate. However, the complexity and logistical machinations of such a large and intricate crusade could only truly be understood by Mr. Logisticans Gilliman. But even Gilliman has its limits. Plus, he doesn't just want to be a nerd staying inside doing homework all day. Gilliman likes to play. So, he established the Officio Logisticarum in order to handle the logistics of the Indomitus Crusade so that he could go play outside with his new toy from his dad. The Officio Logisticarum ensured the forces of the Indomitus Crusade were well stocked and sent to the right places, both of these infamously being a problem for the Imperium. In addition, as the crusade went on, the battle fleets would establish hub fortresses in order to keep the Officio well informed and to handle logistics on the furthest reaches of the crusade. But anyways, with that nerd stuff out of the way, we can finally talk about the fighting of the crusade. The Great Crusade would initially start out slow since Abaddon attempted to jail them in their deployment by assaulting warp nexuses. This slowed down the first stage of the crusade and forced the Imperials to take riskier warp routes. But after some initial roadblocks, the Crusade would begin to pick up steam and they started reclaiming a lot of worlds. They also kind of went on a 40k greatest hits tour, visiting famous worlds like Armageddon, Rin's World, Necromunda, Fenris, Catachan, and honestly, probably any other one you could think of considering how wide sweeping this crusade was. And about 5 years into the Crusade, the initial goal of the Crusade was largely complete since the Crusade had reconquered enough worlds to re-establish relative stability in Imperium Sanctus, and they destroyed enough Chaos forces to quell a bunch of warp storms. However, this is 40k after all, and the most iconic sentence of the setting is that there's only war. So, of course, more problems arose as the myriad threats of the galaxy started a bunch of wars. Around this time, the Chaos Forces were also becoming worryingly unified for a faction called Chaos, and they continue to sow chaos. Perhaps most notably, the Death Guard launched their plague wars in the realm of Ultramar. But for almost half a decade or so, the Crusade wore on, and many epic Warhammer 40Ks were had. Then, 12 years in, Guilliman would semi-abandon the Crusade to return to his home and assist in the escalating Plague Wars, which is a video for another time. But anyways, after kicking his stinky bro back into the warp, Guilliman would finally start to bring the Crusade into Imperium Nihilus. Guilliman's forces would continue to reclaim worlds and attempt to gain control of safe passageways through the Great Rift so that they could aid Imperium Nihilus. Taking a risky route to Nihilus, Guilliman would eventually arrive just in time to save the Blood Angels at the devastation of Baal. And after meeting Dante, Guilliman would be like, "Yeah, this dude's chill AF, man," and appoint him the Regent of Imperium Nihilus. Then, after delivering some supplies, Primaris reinforcements, and doing some more battling, Guilliman would return to Sanctus. And at this point, I think the Indominus Crusade is technically still going on, and the reason I say I think is because GW keeps retconning the Indominus Crusade timeline and events within. Originally, the Crusade lasted like 100 years and was officially concluded when Guilliman fought in the Plague Wars. But then this was changed to the Crusade only lasting 12 years before Guilliman fought in the Plague Wars because a 100-year time skip is just stupid. And they just declared, you know what, man, I don't even know at this point. Let's just say time is broken. So technically, canonically, the Crusade was both 100 years long and 12 years long. And probably everything else years long because the Great Rift opening literally broke the galaxy's time flow. And to the people typing, actually, technically, time already flows at different rates because of relativity and blah 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 blah. The rift broke time so hard that the differences in time are even more drastic than would be naturally possible. And also, technically, that means that nothing I said in this video can be factually incorrect because if so, the warp did it. But with that said, that's the gist of the Indominus Crusade. Basically just a big old crusade to retake worlds lost with the opening of the Great Rift and a vessel to hold big old epic Primarch battles and other wars. And as you likely know, I'm not generally a fan of Primarchs in 40k, but even a silly guy like me has to admit that Guilliman going around kicking ass and fighting his demon brothers does kinda go hard. But also, the Indominus Crusade is essentially the jumping off point for basically all of the current conflicts in the present setting, which I suppose isn't saying too much considering it was essentially a galaxy-wide crusade, but anyways, let me know what you think of the Indominus Crusade, and what do you think of the current era of 40k? To me, the fall of Cadia and subsequent resurrection of Guilliman definitely marked a huge shift in 40k and GW's approach to the setting, so I'd be interested to hear what you guys think of it. I swear the Primarch aura is real because when I was drawing Guilliman, just looking at that guy, it really made me want to spend some money. Hi friends, today we're going to talk about a very stinky, smelly war that smells smelly. Perhaps the most iconic conflict of the Indominus era and the conflict to kick off 8th edition and the Age of Primaris, we have the Plague Wars. Soon after the opening of the Great Rift, the smelly little bitch Nurgle, Lord of Decay and all things sick and icky, saw the huge crisis the Imperium was facing with the galaxy getting torn asunder and thought, it's free real estate. Specifically, the Plague Father wanted to annex the legendary realm of Ultramar. So he would start the Plague Wars. The Plague Wars would first begin not in Ultramar, but rather in a few systems north of Ultramar. Nurgle's forces would seed the planets in these systems with evil-ass diseases which would easily spread and ravage the dense hive cities. And from the deaths of the Imperials, new Nurgle forces would be born. With the Imperials of the system enfeebled by Nurgle's plagues, his demonic legions were able to establish control over the systems with relative ease, and Nurgle's mini-empire would become known as the Scourge Stars, and would serve as Nurgle's spawn point for the upcoming invasion of Ultramar. And technically, at least according to the Codex, the Plague Wars were only the battles to claim the Scourge Stars, but everyone just considers the following battles to also be part of the Plague Wars, so we'll just stick with that. Plus, it's a lot cooler to say Plague Wars than X Battle and X World of Warzone Ultramar, so, you know. Anyways, though, with the Scourge Star secured, Nurgle would order his top 3 commanders to finally invade the realm of Ultramar. The first strike would be carried out by the Demon Primarch Mortarion and his Death Guard legions. Morty had a cute little Nurgle-themed 7-step plan to take over his brother's empire and make his new daddy proud. Similar to the tactics used to win the Scourge Stars, the Nurgle forces heavily utilized virus bombs to infect and weaken the defenders of Ultramar. Hive cities and agri-worlds were targeted to starve the Imperials of manpower, as well as literally starve the manpower that remained. Then, after the virus bombings, Mortarion would lead huge invasions, utilizing the Death Guard's favored attrition tactics in plotting assaults, most importantly of which would be on the planet of Espandor, with Mortarion's creeping Doom offensive, fighting a grand war of attrition with continent-long trench systems that would make a Krieger muddy his trench, if you know what I mean. In addition, Mortarion would also destroy a bunch of weakened worlds in an attempt to goad Guilliman into returning to his home and facing him in a glorious Primarch battle. But, along with Mortarion, Mr. Evil Bastard himself, Typhus the Traveler, as well as Nurgle's favorite former little guy Kugath, the Great Unclean One, would join the war and would lead their own Plague Fleet and Demonic Legions respectively. Typhus led his Plague Fleet to terrorize the outskirts of Ultramar, as well as disrupt Ultramar supply lines. Kugath, on the other hand, would manifest in the hospital world of Ajax to both destroy the researchers making cures to Nurgle's gifts and to convert it to a garden world to create new plagues. And thanks to the near infinite reinforcements from the Scourge Stars, a key strategy of the Nurgle forces was to attack as many worlds at once in order to capitalize on their superior numbers and attritional skills, in order to overwhelm the Ultramarines and Ultramar Auxilia. As the attacks escalated, Rabuda Guild would finally decide to break off from his Indominus crusade and return to defend his home. Upon returning, Guilliman's strategic genius would bring the Death Guard assaults to a halt as he brilliantly crafted counterattacks and defenses to the Death Guard plans. And upon learning of Guilliman's arrival, Mortarion would redirect his forces to the Forge World of Connor. Connor is a major industrial center, a key defensive world on the path to Macragge, and it guarded one of the few stable warp routes in and out of the Macragge system. So, Mortarion sought to take over the world to both bleed the Imperial war machine and to strand the bulk of the Ultramarine forces in the Macragge system. And the invasion of Connor would be one of the most crucial and violent battles in the Plague Wars, as both sides waged wars in labyrinthine manufactorums and vast hive cities. The war would culminate with Mortarion literally launching the infected Death World Lobos across the system like an evil-ass super plague ball. But with great sacrifices, the Imperials managed to pull a badass Death Star 2 run to the core of Lobos and plant a cyclonic warhead in the core to destroy the Plague World before it could devastate Connor. But despite Guilliman leading the Imperial forces to many important victories, the superior numbers of the followers of Nurgle would continue to slowly overwhelm the Ultramarines. And to make matters even worse, Kugath was working on a plague that would be potent enough to kill Guilliman. But, fortunately for the Blue Boyos, a bunch of Ultramarine successors would return to Ultramar and assist their Gene Father. And with the extra manpower, Guilliman was able to plan a brilliant counterattack. Gilliman's first major offensive was the Spear of Espandor, in which he sought to reclaim Espandor from Mortarion's creeping Doom offensive. Beyond reclaiming lost ground, controlling Espandor would also cut off major supply lines and Nurgle reinforcements from the Scourge Stars. And so, after securing the world, Gilliman was able to launch system-wide counterattacks since the Death Guard and Nurgle legions could no longer rely on their near-infinite reinforcements. These counterattacks were very effective and forced the Chaos forces to rush their plans as they launched a huge attack against Parmenio. On this world, Titans clashed, greater demons raised armies, and Marines wreaked havoc. Able to permakill the greater demon Septicus with the Emperor's sword. However, he would later fall into a trap where Mortarion, Typhus, and Kugath jumped him. The three champions in Nurgle nearly killed the Primarch, but he was saved by Imperial Saint Kalia, who maybe, most likely, almost definitely was possessed by the Emperor at that moment to aid Gilliman. Which also technically means that the greatest warriors in Nurgle got beat by a little girl. Typical Nurgle L. But with the defeat on Parmenio and the other Chaos Gods launching an invasion on the Scourge Stars, Nurgle beckoned his forces back to his realm. But Mortarion and Kugath decided to disobey their master in a bid to earn the eternal glory of slaying Gilliman and conquering Ultramar. So, the two bubonic bozos continued their alliance while number one Nurgle fan Typhus followed Daddy's orders and went back to defend the Scourge Stars. And despite the embarrassing loss on Parmenio, Kugath was able to get some of Gilliman's blood, which would be crucial in finally developing a disease able to fell the Primarch, the God Blight. And so, Mortarion and Kugath goaded Gilliman to clashing yet again on the world of Ajax. And although Gilliman knew it was likely a trap, he simply couldn't pass up on an opportunity to beat the shit out of his evil-ass brother. Oh, and also save his citizens, but probably mostly for the epic fight. So, he led Indominus Fleet Primus to invade Ajax and put a stop to Mortarion once and for all. On world, Gilliman and Mortarion engaged in an epic duel as Kugath terrorized Gilliman's forces. And in the climatic battle, Ultra Mega Chad, Katie, and Colonel Odermeyer fucking tank shocked Kugath, impaling the greater demon with his Lehman Russ's battle cannon, and then jumped out to stab Kugath in the face, banishing Nurgle's favorite and the most badass sacrifice ever. Typical Guard W. Meanwhile, in the Primarch clash, Mortarion had gained the upper hand against Gilliman thanks to all the warp energies and demonic power surging through him, and he infected Gilliman with the God Blight. And, true to its name, it would be a blight to a god. But, foolish little demon, Gilliman is no god, no siree. The God Blight would in fact become a blight on the Blight God. In death, Gilliman had a vision of his father, and the Emperor channeled his energies into his last son and briefly possessed the fallen Primarch. The Emperor restored Gilliman's body, forced Mortarion to flee into the warp, and inflicted a blow directly on Nurgle's garden, permanently wounding the Plague God and ending the Plague Wars. And so, with Nurgle's forces banished, Gilliman and the people of Ultramar would decontaminate their realm, and Gilliman would attend to other important matters. And most recently, Gilliman would task Captain Titus in reclaiming the 500 worlds of Ultramar, which include, but are not limited to, those lost to Nurgle in the Plague Wars. And on the chaos end of the poop stick, Kugath was made into a gross little ball sack waiting to respawn, and Mortarion was pulled into Nurgle's evil-ass mansion for some punishment. But Mortarion would later be released to fight in the War in the Rift against the forces of Tzeentch and Khorne, and he would redeem himself there. And that's just about it for the Plague Wars. Very cool stuff. I would really recommend reading the Dark Imperium trilogy if you thought the Plague Wars sounded cool. While the battles are, of course, very epic, I think the most compelling part is Gilliman and his little journey throughout. But be sure to comment what you think about the Plague Wars. And also, I'm actually curious to read about it, but if you were in the hobby when Gilliman and the Plague Wars were first introduced, please let me know what it was like back then. I'd love to see a first-hand account. Also, Gilliman proclaiming he's the last Primarch just Goes so hard, man. I'll never stop lamenting at what could have been.